3 Detective Anecdotes by Charles Dickens. 1. The Pair of Gloves. "It's a singular story, sir," said Inspector Wield of the detective police, who, in company with Sergeants Dorton and Myth, paid us another twilight visit one July evening. And I've been thinking you might like to know it. It's concerning the murder of a young woman, Eliza Grimwood, some years ago over in the Waterloo Road. She was commonly called the Countess because of her handsome appearance and her proud way of carrying herself. And when I saw the poor Countess, I had known her well to speak to, lying dead with her throat cut on the floor of her bedroom, you'll believe me that a variety of reflections calculated to make a man rather low in his spirits came into my head. That's neither here nor there. I went to the house the morning after the murder and examined the body, and made a general observation of the bedroom where it was. Turning down the pillow of the bed with my hand, I found, underneath it, a pair of gloves. A pair of gentlemen's dress gloves, very dirty, and inside the lining the letters T.R. and a cross. Well, sir, I took them gloves away and showed 'em to the magistrate over at Union Hall, before whom the case was. He says, "There's no doubt that this is a discovery that may lead to something very important. And what you have got to do, Wield, is to find out the owner of these gloves." I was of the same opinion, of course, and I went at it immediately. I looked at the gloves pretty narrowly, and it was my opinion that they had been cleaned. There was a smell of sulfur and rosin about 'em, you know, which cleaned gloves usually have, more or less. I took 'em over to a friend of mine at Kennington, who was in that line, and I put it to him. What do you say now? Have these gloves been cleaned? "These gloves have been cleaned," says he. "Have you any idea who cleaned them?" says I. "Not at all," says he. "I've a very distinct idea who didn't clean 'em, and that's myself. But I'll tell you what, Wield, there ain't above 8 or 9 regular glove cleaners in London. There were not, at that time, it seems. And I think I can give you their addresses, and you may find out, by that means, who did clean 'em." Accordingly, he gave me the directions, and I went here, and I went there, and I looked up this man, and I looked up that man, but though they all agreed that the gloves had been cleaned, I couldn't find the man, woman, or child that had cleaned that aforesaid pair of gloves. What with this person not being at home, and that person being expected home in the afternoon, and so forth, the inquiry took me 3 days. On the evening of the 3rd day, coming over Waterloo Bridge from the Surrey side of the river, quite beat, and very much vexed and disappointed, I thought I'd have a shilling's worth of entertainment at the Lyceum Theatre to freshen myself up. So I went into the pit at half price, and I sat myself down next to a very quiet, modest sort of a young man. Seeing I was a stranger, which I thought it just as well to appear to be, he told me the names of the actors on the stage, and we got into conversation. When the play was over, we came out together, and I said, "We've been very companionable and agreeable, and perhaps you wouldn't object to a drain." "Well, you're very good," says he. "I shouldn't object to a drain." Accordingly, we went to a public house near the theatre, sat ourselves down in a quiet room upstairs on the 1st floor, and called for a pint of half and half apiece and a pipe. Well, sir, we put our pipes aboard, and we drank our half and half, and sat a-talking, very sociably, when the young man says, "You must excuse me stopping very long," he says, "because I'm forced to go home in good time. I must be at work all night." "At work all night," says I. "You ain't a baker." "No," he says, laughing, "I ain't a baker." "I thought not," says I. "You haven't the looks of a baker." "No," says he, "I'm a glove cleaner." I was never more astonished in my life than when I heard them words come out of his lips. "You're a glove cleaner, are you?" says I. "Yes," he says, "I am." "Then, perhaps," says I, taking the gloves out of my pocket, "you can tell me who cleaned this pair of gloves." "It's a rum story," I says. "I was dining over at Lambeth the other day at a free and easy, quite promiscuous, with a public company, when some gentleman, he left these gloves behind him. Another gentleman and me, you see, we laid a wager of a sovereign that I wouldn't find out who they belonged to. I've spent as much as 7 shillings already in trying to discover, but if you could help me, I'd stand another 7 and welcome. You see, there's TR and a cross inside." "I see," he says. "Bless you! I know these gloves very well. I've seen dozens of pairs belonging to the same party." "No," says I. "Yes," says he. "Then you know who cleaned 'em?" says I. "Rather so," says he. "My father cleaned 'em." "Where does your father live?" says I. "Just round the corner," says the young man, "near Exeter Street, here. He'll tell you who they belong to, directly." "Would you come round with me now?" says I. "Certainly," says he, "but you needn't tell my father that you found me at the play, you know, because he mightn't like it." "All right." We went round to the place, and there we found an old man in a white apron, with 2 or 3 daughters, all rubbing and cleaning away at lots of gloves in a front parlor. "Oh, father," says the young man, "here's a person been and made a bet about the ownership of a pair of gloves, and I've told him you can settle it." "Good evening, sir," says I to the old gentleman. "Here's the gloves your son speaks of. Letters TR, you see, and a cross." "Oh, yes," he says. "I know these gloves very well. I've cleaned dozens of pairs of 'em. They belong to Mr. Trinkle, the great upholsterer in Cheapside." "Did you get 'em from Mr. Trinkle direct?" says I, "if you'll excuse my asking the question." "No," says he. "Mr. Trinkle always sends 'em to Mr. Phibbs, the haberdasher's, opposite his shop, and the haberdasher sends 'em to me." "Perhaps you wouldn't object to a drain," says I. "Not in the least," says he. So I took the old gentleman out, and we had a little more talk with him and his son over a glass, and we parted excellent friends. This was late on a Saturday night. First thing on the Monday morning, I went to the haberdasher's shop opposite Mr. Trinkle's, the great upholsterer's, in Cheapside. "Mr. Phibbs in the way?" "My name is Mr. Phibbs." "Oh. I believe you sent this pair of gloves to be cleaned?" "Yes, I did, for young Mr. Trinkle over the way. There he is, in the shop." "Oh." "That's him in the shop, is it? Him, in the green coat?" "The same individual." "Well, Mr. Phibbs, this is an unpleasant affair, but the fact is, I am Inspector Wield of the Detective Police, and I found these gloves under the pillow of the young woman that was murdered the other day, over in the Waterloo Road." "Good heaven," says he. "He's a most respectable young man, and if his father was to hear of it, it would be the ruin of him." "I'm very sorry for it," says I, "but I must take him into custody." "Good heaven," says Mr. Phibbs again. "Can nothing be done?" "Nothing," says I. "Will you allow me to call him over here," says he, "that his father may not see it done?" "I don't object to that," says I, "but, unfortunately, Mr. Phibbs, I can't allow of any communication between you. If any was attempted, I should have to interfere directly. Perhaps you'll beckon him over here?" Mr. Phibbs went to the door and beckoned, and the young fellow came across the street directly, a smart, brisk young fellow. "Good morning, sir," says I. "Good morning, sir," says he. "Would you allow me to inquire, sir," says I, "if you ever had any acquaintance with a party of the name of Grimwood?" "Grimwood? Grimwood," says he. "No." "You know the Waterloo Road?" "Oh, of course I know the Waterloo Road." "Happen to have heard of a young woman being murdered there?" "Yes." "I read it in the paper, and very sorry I was to read it." "Here's a pair of gloves belonging to you that I found under her pillow the morning afterward." He was in a dreadful state, sir, a dreadful state. "Mr. Wield," he says, "upon my solemn oath, I never was there. I never so much as saw her, to my knowledge, in my life." "I am very sorry," says I. "To tell you the truth, I don't think you are the murderer, but I must take you to Union Hall in a cab. However, I think it's a case of that sort that, at present, at all events, the magistrate will hear it in private." A private examination took place, and then it came out that this young man was acquainted with a cousin of the unfortunate Eliza Grimwood, and that, calling to see this cousin a day or two before the murder, he left these gloves upon the table. Who should come in shortly afterward but Eliza Grimwood? "Whose gloves are these?" she says, taking 'em up. "Those are Mr. Trinkle's gloves," says her cousin. "Oh," says she, "they are very dirty and of no use to him, I am sure. I shall take 'em away for my girl to clean the stoves with." And she put 'em in her pocket. The girl had used 'em to clean the stoves, and, I have no doubt, had left 'em lying on the bedroom mantelpiece or on the drawers or somewhere, and her mistress, looking round to see that the room was tidy, had caught 'em up and put 'em under the pillow where I found 'em. That's the story, sir. 2. The Artful Touch. "One of the most beautiful things that was ever done, perhaps," said Inspector Wield, emphasizing the adjective, as preparing us to expect dexterity or ingenuity rather than strong interest, "was a move of Sergeant Witcham's. It was a lovely idea. Witcham and me were down at Epsom one Derby day, waiting at the station for the swell mob. As I mentioned, when we were talking about these things before, we are ready at the station when there's races, or an agricultural show, or a chancellor sworn in for a university, or Jenny Lind, or anything of that sort. And as the swell mob come down, we send 'em back again by the next train. But some of the swell mob, on the occasion of this derby that I refer to, so far kiddied us as to hire a horse and shay, start away from London by Whitechapel, and miles round, come into Epsom from the opposite direction, and go to work right and left on the course while we were waiting for him at the rail. That, however, ain't the point of what I'm going to tell you. While Witchem and me were waiting at the station, there comes up one Mr. Tat, a gentleman formerly in the public line, quite an amateur detective in his way, and very much respected. "Hello, Charlie Weald," he says. "What are you doing here? On the lookout for some of your old friends?" "Yes, the old move, Mr. Tat." "Come along," he says, "you and Witchem, and have a glass of sherry." "We can't stir from the place," says I, "till the next train comes in. But after that, we will with pleasure." Mr. Tat waits, and the train comes in, and then Witchem and me go off with him to the hotel. Mr. Tat, he's got up quite regardless of expense for the occasion, and in his shirt front there's a beautiful diamond prop, cost him £15 or £20, a very handsome pin indeed. We drink our sherry at the bar, and have had our 3 or 4 glasses, when Witchem cries suddenly, "Look out, Mr. Weald! Stand fast!" And a dash is made into the place by the swell mob, 4 of 'em, that have come down, as I tell you, and in a moment Mr. Tat's prop is gone. Witchem, he cuts 'em off at the door. I lay about me as hard as I can. Mr. Tat shows fight like a good un, and there we are, all down together, heads and heels knocking about on the floor of the bar. Perhaps you never see such a scene of confusion. However, we stick to our men, Mr. Tat being as good as any officer, and we take 'em all, and carry 'em off to the station. The station's full of people who have been took on the course, and it's a precious piece of work to get 'em secured. However, we do it at last, and we search 'em. But nothing's found upon 'em, and they're locked up. And a pretty state of heat we are in by that time, I assure you. I was very blank over it myself, to think that the prop had been passed away, and I said to Witchem, when we had set him to rights, and were cooling ourselves along with Mr. Tat, "We don't take much by this move, anyway, for nothing's found upon him, and it's only the braggadocia, after all." "What do you mean, Mr. Weald?" says Witchem. "Here's the diamond pin, and in the palm of his hand, there it was, safe and sound." "Why, in the name of wonder," says me and Mr. Tat, in astonishment, "how did you come by that?" "I'll tell you how I come by it," says he. "I saw which of 'em took it, and when we were all down on the floor together, knocking about, I just gave him a little touch on the back of his hand, as I knew his pal would, and he thought it was his pal, and gave it me. It was beautiful. Beautiful. Even that was hardly the best of the case, for that chap was tried at the quarter sessions at Guildford. You know what quarter sessions are, sir. Well, if you'll believe me, while them slow justices were looking over the Acts of Parliament to see what they could do to him, I'm blowed if he didn't cut out of the dock before their faces. He cut out of the dock, sir, then and there, swam across a river, and got up into a tree to dry himself. In the tree he was took, an old woman having seen him climb up, and Witchem's artful touch transported him. 3. The sofa. What young men will do, sometimes, to ruin themselves and break their friends' hearts, said Sergeant Dorton. It's surprising. I had a case at St. Blank's Hospital, which was of this sort. A bad case, indeed, with a bad end. The secretary and the house surgeon and the treasurer of St. Blank's Hospital came to Scotland Yard to give information of numerous robberies having been committed on the students. The students could leave nothing in the pockets of their greatcoats, while the greatcoats were hanging at the hospital, but it was almost certain to be stolen. Property of various descriptions was constantly being lost, and the gentlemen were naturally uneasy about it, and anxious for the credit of the institution, that the thief or thieves should be discovered. The case was entrusted to me, and I went to the hospital. "Now, gentlemen," said I, after we had talked it over, "I understand this property is usually lost from one room." "Yes," they said, "it was." "I should wish, if you please," said I, "to see the room." It was a good-sized bare room downstairs, with a few tables and forms in it, and a row of pegs all round for hats and coats. "Next, gentlemen," said I, "do you suspect anybody?" Yes, they said, they did suspect somebody. They were sorry to say they suspected one of the porters. "I should like," said I, "to have that man pointed out to me, and have a little time to look after him." He was pointed out, and I looked after him, and then I went back to the hospital and said, "Now, gentlemen, it's not the porter. He's unfortunately for himself a little too fond of drink, but he's nothing worse. My suspicion is that these robberies are committed by one of the students, and if you'll put me a sofa into that room where the pegs are, as there's no closet, I think I shall be able to detect the thief. I wish the sofa, if you please, to be covered with chintz or something of that sort, so that I may lie on my chest underneath it without being seen." The sofa was provided, and the next day, at 11 o'clock, before any of the students came, I went there with those gentlemen to get underneath it. It turned out to be one of those old-fashioned sofas with a great cross-beam at the bottom that would have broken my back in no time if I could ever have got below it. We had quite a job to break all this away in time. However, I fell to work, and they fell to work, and we broke it out and made a clear place for me. I got under the sofa, lay down on my chest, took out my knife, and made a convenient hole in the chintz to look through. It was then settled between me and the gentlemen that when the students were all up in the wards, one of the gentlemen should come in and hang up a greatcoat on one of the pegs, and that the greatcoat should have, in one of the pockets, a pocketbook containing marked money. After I had been there some time, the students began to drop into the room by ones and twos and threes, and to talk about all sorts of things, little thinking there was anybody under the sofa, and then go upstairs. At last, there came in one who remained until he was alone in the room by himself. A tallish, good-looking young man of 21 or 22, with a light whisker. He went to a particular hat peg, took off a good hat that was hanging there, tried it on, hung his own hat in its place, and hung that hat on another peg nearly opposite to me. I then felt quite certain that he was the thief, and would come back by and by. When they were all upstairs, the gentleman came in with the greatcoat. I showed him where to hang it, so that I might have a good view of it, and went away. and I lay under the sofa on my chest for a couple of hours or so, waiting. At last, the same young man came down. He walked across the room, whistling, stopped and listened, took another walk and whistled, stopped again and listened, then began to go regularly round the pegs, feeling in the pockets of all the coats. When he came to the great coat and felt the pocketbook, he was so eager and so hurried that he broke the strap in tearing it open. As he began to put the money in his pocket, I crawled out from under the sofa, and his eyes met mine. My face, as you may perceive, is brown now, but it was pale at that time, my health not being good, and looked as long as a horse's. Besides which, there was a great draught of air from the door, underneath the sofa, and I had tied a handkerchief round my head, so what I looked like altogether, I don't know. He turned blue, literally blue, when he saw me crawling out, and I couldn't feel surprised at it. "I am an officer of the detective police," said I, "and have been lying here since you first came in this morning. I regret, for the sake of yourself and your friends, that you should have done what you have, but this case is complete. You have the pocketbook in your hand and the money upon you, and I must take you into custody." It was impossible to make out any case in his behalf, and on his trial, he pleaded guilty. How or when he got the means, I don't know, but while he was awaiting his sentence, he poisoned himself in Newgate. We inquired of this officer, on the conclusion of the foregoing anecdote, whether the time appeared long or short when he lay in that constrained position under the sofa. "Why, you see, sir," he replied, "if he hadn't come in the first time, and I had not been quite sure he was the thief and would return, the time would have seemed long. But, as it was, I being dead certain of my man, the time seemed pretty short." The Biter Bit by Wilkie Collins. Extracted from the correspondence of the London Police. From Chief Inspector Theakstone of the Detective Police to Sergeant Bulmer of the same force. London, 4th July, 18XX. Sergeant Bulmer. This is to inform you that you are wanted to assist in looking up a case of importance, which will require all the attention of an experienced member of the force. The matter of the robbery on which you are now engaged, you will please to shift over to the young man who brings you this letter. You will tell him all the circumstances of the case just as they stand. You will put him up to the progress you have made, if any, towards detecting the person or persons by whom the money has been stolen, and you will leave him to make the best he can of the matter now in your hands. He is to have the whole responsibility of the case, and the whole credit of his success if he brings it to a proper issue. So much for the orders that I am desired to communicate to you. A word in your ear next about this new man who is to take your place. His name is Matthew Sharpen, and he is to have the chance given him of dashing into our office at one jump, supposing he turns out strong enough to take it. You will naturally ask me how he comes by this privilege. I can only tell you that he has some uncommonly strong interest to back him in certain high quarters, which you and I had better not mention except under our breaths. He has been a lawyer's clerk, and he is wonderfully conceited in his opinion of himself, as well as mean and underhand to look at. According to his account, he leaves his old trade and joins ours of his own free will and preference. You will no more believe that than I do. My notion is that he has managed to ferret out some private information in connection with the affairs of one of his master's clients, which makes him rather an awkward customer to keep in the office for the future, and which, at the same time, gives him hold enough over his employer to make it dangerous to drive him into a corner by turning him away. I think giving him this unheard-of chance among us is, in plain words, pretty much like giving him hush money to keep him quiet. However that may be, Mr. Matthew Sharpen is to have the case now in your hands, and if he succeeds with it, he pokes his ugly nose into our office as sure as fate. I put you up to this, Sergeant, so that you may not stand in your own light by giving the new man any cause to complain of you at headquarters, and remain yours, Francis Theakstone. From Mr. Matthew Sharpen to Chief Inspector Theakstone. London, 5th July, 18XX. Dear Sir, having now been favored with the necessary instructions from Sergeant Bulmer, I beg to remind you of certain directions which I have received relating to the report of my future proceedings which I am to prepare for examination at headquarters. The object of my writing, and of your examining what I have written before you send it to the higher authorities, is, I am informed, to give me, as an untried hand, the benefit of your advice in case I want it, which I venture to think I shall not, at any stage of my proceedings. As the extraordinary circumstances of the case on which I am now engaged make it impossible for me to absent myself from the place where the robbery was committed until I have made some progress towards discovering the thief, I am necessarily precluded from consulting you personally. Hence, the necessity of my writing down the various details which might, perhaps, be better communicated by word of mouth. This, if I am not mistaken, is the position in which we are now placed. I state my own impressions on the subject in writing, in order that we may clearly understand each other at the outset, and have the honor to remain your obedient servant, Matthew Sharpen. From Chief Inspector Theakstone to Mr. Matthew Sharpen. London, 5th July, 18XX. Sir, you have begun by wasting time, ink, and paper. We both of us perfectly well knew the position we stood in toward each other when I sent you with my letter to Sergeant Bulmer. There was not the least need to repeat it in writing. Be so good as to employ your pen in future on the business actually in hand. You now have 3 separate matters on which to write me. First, you have to draw up a statement of your instructions received from Sergeant Bulmer in order to show us that nothing has escaped your memory, and that you are thoroughly acquainted with all the circumstances of the case which has been entrusted to you. Secondly, you are to inform me what it is you propose to do. Thirdly, you are to report every inch of your progress, if you make any, from day to day, and, if need be, from hour to hour as well. This is your duty. As to what my duty may be, when I want you to remind me of it, I will write and tell you so. In the meantime, I remain yours, Francis Theakstone. From Mr. Matthew Sharpin to Chief Inspector Theakstone, London, 6th July, 18XX. Sir, you are rather an elderly person, and, as such, naturally inclined to be a little jealous of men like me, who are in the prime of their lives and their faculties. Under these circumstances, it is my duty to be considerate toward you, and to not bear too hardly on your small failings. I decline, therefore, altogether to take offense at the tone of your letter. I give you the full benefit of the natural generosity of my nature. I sponge the very existence of your surly communication out of my memory. In short, Chief Inspector Theakstone, I forgive you, and proceed to business. My first duty is to draw up a full statement of the instructions I have received from Sergeant Bulmer. Here they are at your service according to my version of them. At number 13 Rutherford Street, Soho, there is a stationer's shop. It is kept by one Mr. Yatman. He is a married man, but has no family. Besides Mr. and Mrs. Yatman, the other inmates in the house are a lodger, a single young man named J, who occupies the front room on the second floor, a shopman who sleeps in one of the attics, and a servant-of-all-work, whose bed is in the back kitchen. Once a week, a charwoman comes to help this servant. These are all the persons who, on ordinary occasions, have means of access to their interior of the house, placed, as a matter of course, at their disposal. Mr. Yatman has been in business for many years, carrying on his affairs prosperously enough to realize a handsome independence for a person in his position. Unfortunately for himself, he endeavored to increase the amount of his property by speculating. He ventured boldly in his investments. Luck went against him, and rather less than 2 years ago, he found himself a poor man again. All that was saved out of the wreck of his property was the sum of £200. Although Mr. Yatman did his best to meet his altered circumstances by giving up many of the luxuries and comforts to which he and his wife had been accustomed, he found it impossible to retrench so far as to allow of putting by any money from the income produced by his shop. The business has been declining of late years. The cheap advertising stationers have done it injury with the public. Consequently, up to the last week, the only surplus property possessed by Mr. Yatman consisted of the £200 which had been recovered from the wreck of his fortune. This sum was placed as a deposit in a joint stock bank of the highest possible character. 8 days ago, Mr. Yatman and his lodger, Mr. J, held a conversation on the subject of the commercial difficulties which are hampering trade in all directions at the present time. Mr. J, who lives by supplying the newspapers with short paragraphs relating to accidents, offenses, and brief records of remarkable occurrences in general, who is, in short, what they call a penny-a-liner, told his landlord that he had been in the city that day and heard unfavorable rumors on the subject of joint stock banks. The rumors to which he alluded had already reached the ears of Mr. Yatman from other quarters, and the confirmation of them by his lodger had such an effect on his mind, predisposed as it was to alarm by the experience of his former losses, that he resolved to go at once to the bank and withdraw his deposit. It was then getting on toward the end of the afternoon, and he arrived just in time to receive his money before the bank closed. He received the deposit in banknotes of the following amounts: 1 50-pound note, 3 20-pound notes, 6 10-pound notes, and 6 5-pound notes. His object in drawing the money in this form was to have it ready to lay out immediately in trifling loans on good security among the small tradespeople of his district, some of whom are sorely pressed for the very means of existence at the present time. Investments of this kind seemed to Mr. Yatman to be the most safe and the most profitable on which he could now venture. He brought the money back in an envelope placed in his breast pocket, and asked his shopman, on getting home, to look for a small, flat, tin cash box, which had not been used for years, and which, as Mr. Yatman remembered it, was exactly of the right size to hold the banknotes. For some time the cash box was searched for in vain. Mr. Yatman called to his wife to know if she had any idea where it was. The question was overheard by the servant of all work, who was taking up the tea tray at the time, and by Mr. J., who was coming downstairs on his way out to the theater. Ultimately, the cash box was found by the shopman. Mr. Yatman placed the banknotes in it, secured them by a padlock, and put the box in his coat pocket. It stuck out of the coat pocket a very little, but enough to be seen. Mr. Yatman remained at home, upstairs, all that evening. No visitors called. At 11 o'clock he went to bed, and put the cash box under his pillow. When he and his wife woke the next morning, the box was gone. Payment of the notes was immediately stopped at the Bank of England, but no news of the money has been heard of since that time. So far, the circumstances of the case are perfectly clear. They point unmistakably to the conclusion that the robbery must have been committed by some person living in the house. Suspicion falls, therefore, upon the servant of all work, upon the shopman, and upon Mr. J. The two first knew that the cash box was being inquired for by their master, but did not know what it was he wanted to put into it. They would assume, of course, that it was money. They both had opportunities, the servant when she took away the tea, and the shopman when he came, after shutting up, to give the keys of the till to his master, of seeing the cash box in Mr. Yatman's pocket, and of inferring naturally, from its position there, that he intended to take it into his bedroom with him at night. Mr. J., on the other hand, had been told during the afternoon's conversation on the subject of joint stock banks that his landlord had a deposit of £200 in one of them. He also knew that Mr. Yatman left him with the intention of drawing that money out, and he heard the inquiry for the cash box afterward when he was coming downstairs. He must, therefore, have inferred that the money was in the house, and that the cash box was the receptacle intended to contain it. That he could have had any idea, however, of the place in which Mr. Yatman intended to keep it for the night is impossible, seeing that he went out before the box was found, and did not return till his landlord was in bed. Consequently, if he committed the robbery, he must have gone into the bedroom purely on speculation. Speaking of the bedroom reminds me of the necessity of noticing the situation of it in the house, and the means that exist of gaining easy access to it at any hour of the night. The room in question is the back room on the first floor. In consequence of Mrs. Yatman's constitutional nervousness on the subject of fire, which makes her apprehend being burned alive in her room in case of accident, by the hampering of the lock if the key is turned in it, her husband has never been accustomed to lock the bedroom door. Both he and his wife are, by their own admission, heavy sleepers. Consequently, the risk to be run by any evil-disposed persons wishing to plunder the bedroom was of the most trifling kind. They could enter the room by merely turning the handle of the door, and, if they moved with ordinary caution, there was no fear of their waking the sleepers inside. This fact is of importance. It strengthens our conviction that the money must have been taken by one of the inmates of the house, because it tends to show that the robbery, in this case, might have been committed by persons not possessed of the superior vigilance and cunning of the experienced thief. Such are the circumstances as they were related to Sergeant Bulmer when he was first called in to discover the guilty parties, and, if possible, to recover the lost banknotes. The strictest inquiry which he could institute failed of producing the smallest fragment of evidence against any of the persons on whom suspicion naturally fell. Their language and behavior on being informed of the robbery was perfectly consistent with the language and behavior of innocent people. Sergeant Bulmer felt from the first that this was a case for private inquiry and secret observation. He began by recommending Mr. and Mrs. Yatman to affect a feeling of perfect confidence in the innocence of the persons living under their roof, and he then opened the campaign by employing himself in following the goings and comings and in discovering the friends, the habits, and the secrets of the maid-of-all-work. 3 days and nights of exertion on his own part and on that of the others who were competent to assist his investigations were enough to satisfy him that there was no cause for suspicion against the girl. He next practiced the same precaution in relation to the shopman. There was more difficulty and uncertainty in privately clearing up this person's character without his knowledge, but the obstacles were at last smoothed away with tolerable success, and, though there is not the same amount of certainty in this case which there was in the case of the girl, there is still fair reason for supposing that the shopman has had nothing to do with the robbery of the cash box. As a necessary consequence of these proceedings, the range of suspicion now becomes limited to the lodger, Mr. J. When I presented your letter of introduction to Sergeant Bulmer, he had already made some inquiries on the subject of this young man. The result, so far, has not been at all favorable. Mr. J.'s habits are irregular. He frequents public houses and seems to be familiarly acquainted with a great many dissolute characters. He is in debt to most of the tradespeople whom he employs. He has not paid his rent to Mr. Yatman for the last month. Yesterday evening he came home excited by liquor, and last week he was seen talking to a prize fighter. In short, though Mr. J. does call himself a journalist, in virtue of his penny-a-line contributions to the newspapers, he is a young man of low tastes, vulgar manners, and bad habits. Nothing has yet been discovered in relation to him which redounds to his credit in the smallest degree. I have now reported, down to the very last details, all the particulars communicated to me by Sergeant Bulmer. I believe you will not find an omission anywhere, and I think you will admit, though you are prejudiced against me, that a clearer statement of facts was never laid before you than the statement I have now made. My next duty is to tell you what I propose to do now that the case is confided to my hands. In the first place, it is clearly my business to take up the case at the point where Sergeant Bulmer has left it. On his authority, I am justified in assuming that I have no need to trouble myself about the maid-of-all-work and the shopman. Their characters are now to be considered as cleared up. What remains to be privately investigated is the question of the guilt or innocence of Mr. J. Before we give up the notes for lost, we must make sure, if we can, that he knows nothing about them. This is the plan that I have adopted, with the full approval of Mr. and Mrs. Yatman for discovering whether Mr. J is or is not the person who has stolen the cash box. I propose today to present myself at the house in the character of a young man who is looking for lodgings. The back room on the second floor will be shown to me as the room to let, and I shall establish myself there tonight as a person from the country who has come to London to look for a situation in a respectable shop or office. By this means, I shall be living next to the room occupied by Mr. J. The partition between us is mere lath and plaster. I shall make a small hole in it, near the cornice, through which I can see what Mr. J does in his room and hear every word that is said when any friend happens to call on him. Whenever he is at home, I shall be at my post of observation. Whenever he goes out, I shall be after him. By employing these means of watching him, I believe I may look forward to the discovery of his secret, if he knows anything about the lost banknotes, as to a dead certainty. What you may think of my plan of observation, I cannot undertake to say. It appears to me to unite the invaluable merits of boldness and simplicity. Fortified by this conviction, I close the present communication with feelings of the most sanguine description in regard to the future, and remain your obedient servant, Matthew Sharpen. From the same to the same, 7th July. Sir, as you have not honored me with any answer to my last communication, I assume that, in spite of your prejudices against me, it has produced the favorable impression on your mind which I ventured to anticipate. Gratified and encouraged beyond measure by the token of approval which your eloquent silence conveys to me, I proceed to report the progress that has been made in the course of the last 24 hours. I am now comfortably established next door to Mr. J, and I am delighted to say that I have 2 holes in the partition instead of 1. My natural sense of humor has led me into the pardonable extravagance of giving them both appropriate names. One I call my peephole, and the other my pipe-hole. The name of the first explains itself. The name of the second refers to a small tin pipe or tube inserted in the hole and twisted so that the mouth of it comes close to my ear while I am standing at my post of observation. Thus, while I am looking at Mr. J through my peephole, I can hear every word that may be spoken in his room through my pipe-hole. Perfect candor, a virtue which I have possessed from my childhood, compels me to acknowledge, before I go any farther, that the ingenious notion of adding a pipe-hole to my proposed peep-hole originated with Mrs. Yatman. This lady, a most intelligent and accomplished person, simple and yet distinguished in her manners, has entered into my little plans with an enthusiasm and intelligence which I cannot too highly praise. Mr. Yatman is so cast down by his loss that he is quite incapable of affording me any assistance. Mrs. Yatman, who is evidently most tenderly attached to him, feels her husband's sad condition of mind even more acutely than she feels the loss of the money, and is mainly stimulated to exertion by her desire to assist in raising him from the miserable state of prostration into which he has now fallen. "The money, Mr. Sharpen," she said to me yesterday evening with tears in her eyes, "the money may be regained by rigid economy and strict attention to business. It is my husband's wretched state of mind that makes me so anxious for the discovery of the thief. I may be wrong, but I felt hopeful of success as soon as you entered the house, and I believe that, if the wretch who robbed us is to be found, you are the man to discover him." I accepted this gratifying compliment in the spirit in which it was offered, firmly believing that I shall be found, sooner or later, to have thoroughly deserved it. Let me now return to business, that is to say, to my peephole and my pipe-hole. I have enjoyed some hours of calm observation of Mr. J. Though rarely at home, as I understand from Mrs. Yatman, on ordinary occasions, he has been indoors the whole of this day. That is suspicious, to begin with. I have to report, farther, that he rose at a late hour this morning, always a bad sign in a young man, and that he lost a great deal of time after he was up, in yawning and complaining to himself of a headache. Like other debauched characters, he ate little or nothing for breakfast. His next proceeding was to smoke a pipe, a dirty clay pipe which a gentleman would have been ashamed to put between his lips. When he had done smoking, he took out pen, ink, and paper, and sat down to write with a groan, whether of remorse for having taken the banknotes, or of disgust at the task before him, I am unable to say. After writing a few lines, too far away from my peephole to give me a chance of reading over his shoulder, he leaned back in his chair and amused himself by humming the tunes of popular songs. I recognized My Mary Ann, Bobbin' Around, and Old Dog Tray among other melodies. Whether these do or do not represent secret signals by which he communicates with his accomplices remains to be seen. After he had amused himself for some time by humming, he got up and began to walk about the room, occasionally stopping to add a sentence to the paper on his desk. Before long, he went to a locked cupboard and opened it. I strained my eyes eagerly in expectation of making a discovery. I saw him take something carefully out of the cupboard. He turned round, and it was only a pint bottle of brandy. Having drunk some of the liquor, this extremely indolent reprobate lay down on his bed again, and in 5 minutes was fast asleep. After hearing him snoring for at least 2 hours, I was recalled to my peephole by a knock at his door. He jumped up and opened it with suspicious activity. A very small boy with a very dirty face walked in, said, "Please, sir, they're waiting for you," sat down with his legs a long way from the ground, and instantly fell asleep. Mr. J. swore an oath, tied a wet towel round his head, and, going back to his paper, began to cover it with writing as fast as his fingers could move the pen. Occasionally getting up to dip the towel in water and tie it on again, he continued at this employment for nearly 3 hours, then folded up the leaves of writing, woke the boy, and gave them to him with this remarkable expression. "Now then, young sleepyhead, quick march! If you see the governor, tell him to have the money ready for me when I call for it." The boy grinned and disappeared. I was sorely tempted to follow Sleepyhead, but on reflection considered it safest still to keep my eye on the proceedings of Mr. J. In half an hour's time, he put on his hat and walked out. Of course, I put on my hat and walked out also. As I went downstairs, I passed Mrs. Yatman going up. The lady has been kind enough to undertake, by previous arrangement between us, to search Mr. J.'s room while he is out of the way, and while I am necessarily engaged in the pleasing duty of following him wherever he goes. On the occasion to which I now refer, he walked straight to the nearest tavern, and ordered a couple of mutton chops for his dinner. I placed myself in the next box to him, and ordered a couple of mutton chops for my dinner. Before I had been in the room a minute, a young man of highly suspicious manners and appearance, sitting at a table opposite, took his glass of porter in his hand, and joined Mr. J. I pretended to be reading the newspaper, and listened, as in duty bound, with all my might. "Jack has been here, inquiring after you," says the young man. "Did he leave any message?" asks Mr. J. "Yes," says the other. "He told me, if I met you, to say that he wished very particularly to see you tonight, and that he would give you a look-in at Rutherford Street at 7 o'clock. "All right," says Mr. J. "I'll get back in time to see him." Upon this, the suspicious-looking man finished his porter, and saying that he was rather in a hurry, took leave of his friend. Perhaps I should not be wrong if I said his accomplice, and left the room. At 25 minutes and a half past 6, in these serious cases it is important to be particular about time, Mr. J. finished his chops and paid his bill. At 26 minutes and 3/4, I finished my chops and paid mine. In 10 minutes more, I was inside the house in Rutherford Street, and was received by Mrs. Yatman in the passage. That charming woman's face exhibited an expression of melancholy and disappointment which it quite grieved me to see. "I am afraid, ma'am," says I, "that you have not hit on any little criminating discovery in the lodger's room?" She shook her head and sighed. It was a soft, languid, fluttering sigh, and upon my life, it quite upset me. For the moment, I forgot business, and burned with envy of Mr. Yatman. "Don't despair, ma'am," I said, with an insinuating mildness which seemed to touch her. "I have heard a mysterious conversation. I know of a guilty appointment, and I expect great things from my peephole and my pipe-hole tonight. Pray, don't be alarmed, but I think we are on the brink of a discovery." Here, my enthusiastic devotion to business got the better part of my tender feelings. I looked, winked, nodded, left her. When I got back to my observatory, I found Mr. J. digesting his mutton chops in an armchair, with his pipe in his mouth. On his table were 2 tumblers, a jug of water, and the pint bottle of brandy. It was then close upon 7 o'clock. As the hour struck, the person described as Jack walked in. He looked agitated. I am happy to say he looked violently agitated. The cheerful glow of anticipated success diffused itself, to use a strong expression, all over me, from head to foot. With breathless interest, I looked through my peephole and saw the visitor, the Jack of this delightful case, sit down, facing me at the opposite side of the table to Mr. J. Making allowance for the difference in expression which their countenances just now happened to exhibit, these two abandoned villains were so much alike in other respects as to lead one at once to the conclusion that they were brothers. Jack was the cleaner man and the better dressed of the two. I admit that at the outset. It is perhaps one of my failings to push justice and impartiality to their utmost limits. I am no Pharisee, and where vice has its redeeming point, I say, let vice have its due. Yes, by all manner of means, let vice have its due. "What's the matter now, Jack?" says Mr. J. "Can't you see it in my face?" says Jack. "My dear fellow, delays are dangerous. Let's have done with suspense and risk it the day after tomorrow." "So soon as that?" cries Mr. J, looking very much astonished. "Well, I'm quite ready if you are. But, I say, Jack, is somebody else ready too? Are you quite sure of that?" He smiled as he spoke, a frightful smile, and laid a very strong emphasis on those two words, somebody else. There is evidently a third ruffian, a nameless desperado, concerned in the business. "Meet us tomorrow," says Jack, "and judge for yourself. Be in the Regent's Park at 11 in the morning, and look out for us at the turning that leads to the Avenue Road." "I'll be there," says Mr. J. "Have a drop of brandy and water?" "What are you getting up for? You're not going already?" "Yes, I am," says Jack. "The fact is, I'm so excited and agitated that I can't sit still anywhere for 5 minutes together. Ridiculous as it may appear to you, I'm in a perpetual state of nervous flutter. I can't, for the life of me, help fearing that we shall be found out. I fancy that every man who looks twice at me in the street is a spy." At these words, I thought my legs would have given way under me. Nothing but strength of mind kept me at my peephole, nothing else. I give you my word of honor. "Stuff and nonsense," cries Mr. J, with all the effrontery of a veteran in crime. "We have kept the secret up to this time, and we will manage cleverly to the end. Have a drop of brandy and water, and you will feel as certain about it as I do." Jack steadily refused the brandy and water, and steadily persisted in taking his leave. "I must try if I can't walk it off," he said. "Remember, tomorrow morning, 11 o'clock, Avenue Road, side of Regent's Park." With those words, he went out. His hardened relative laughed desperately and resumed the dirty clay pipe. I sat down on the side of my bed, actually quivering with excitement. It is clear to me that no attempt has yet been made to change the stolen banknotes, and I may add that Sergeant Bulmer was of that opinion also when he left the case in my hands. What is the natural conclusion to draw from the conversation which I have just set down? Evidently, that the Confederates meet tomorrow to take their respective shares in the stolen money and to decide on the safest means of getting the notes changed the day after. Mr. J is, beyond a doubt, the leading criminal in this business, and he will probably run the chief risk, that of changing the 50-pound note. I shall, therefore, still make it my business to follow him, attending at the Regent's Park tomorrow, and doing my best to hear what is said there. If another appointment is made for the day after, I shall, of course, go to it. In the meantime, I shall want the immediate assistance of 2 competent persons, supposing the rascals separate after their meeting, to follow the 2 minor criminals. It is only fair to add, if the rogues all retire together, I shall probably keep my subordinates in reserve. Being naturally ambitious, I desire, if possible, to have the whole credit of discovering this robbery to myself. 8th July. I have to acknowledge, with thanks, the speedy arrival of my 2 subordinates, men of very average abilities, I am afraid, but, fortunately, I shall always be on the spot to direct them. My first business this morning was necessarily to prevent possible mistakes by accounting to Mr. and Mrs. Yatman for the presence of 2 strangers on the scene. Mr. Yatman, between ourselves, a poor, feeble man, only shook his head and groaned. Mrs. Yatman, that superior woman, favored me with a charming look of intelligence. "Oh, Mr. Sharpin," she said, "I am so sorry to see those 2 men. Your sending for their assistance looks as if you were beginning to be doubtful of success." I privately winked at her. She is very good in allowing me to do so without taking offense, and told her, in my facetious way, that she labored under a slight mistake. "It is because I am sure of success, ma'am, that I send for them. I am determined to recover the money, not for my own sake only, but for Mr. Yatman's sake, and for yours." I laid a considerable amount of stress on those last 3 words. She said, "Oh, Mr. Sharpin," again, and blushed of a heavenly red, and looked down at her work. I could go to the world's end with that woman, if Mr. Yatman would only die. I sent off the 2 subordinates to wait until I wanted them at the Avenue Road gate of the Regent's Park. Half an hour afterward, I was following the same direction myself, at the heels of Mr. J. The 2 confederates were punctual to the appointed time. I blush to record it, but it is nevertheless necessary to state that the 3rd rogue, the nameless desperado of my report, or, if you prefer it, the mysterious somebody else of the conversation between the 2 brothers, is a woman, and, what is worse, a young woman, and what is more lamentable still, a nice-looking woman. I have long resisted a growing conviction that, wherever there is mischief in this world, an individual of the fair sex is inevitably certain to be mixed up in it. After the experience of this morning, I can struggle against that sad conclusion no longer. I give up the sex, excepting Mrs. Yatman. I give up the sex. The man named Jack offered the woman his arm. Mr. J. placed himself on the other side of her. The 3 then walked away slowly among the trees. I followed them at a respectful distance. My 2 subordinates, at a respectful distance also, followed me. It was, I deeply regret to say, impossible to get near enough to them to overhear their conversation without running too great a risk of being discovered. I could only infer from their gestures and actions that they were all 3 talking with extraordinary earnestness on some subject which deeply interested them. After having been engaged in this way a full quarter of an hour, they suddenly turned round to retrace their steps. My presence of mind did not forsake me in this emergency. I signed to the 2 subordinates to walk on carelessly and pass them, while I myself slipped dexterously behind a tree. As they came by me, I heard Jack address these words to Mr. J. "Let us say 10:30 tomorrow morning, and mind you, "Come in a cab. We had better not risk taking one in this neighborhood." Mr. J. made some brief reply which I could not overhear. They walked back to the place at which they had met, shaking hands there with an audacious cordiality which it quite sickened me to see. They then separated. I followed Mr. J. My subordinates paid the same delicate attention to the other two. Instead of taking me back to Rutherford Street, Mr. J. led me to the Strand. He stopped at a dingy, disreputable-looking house, which, according to the inscription over the door, was a newspaper office, but which, in my judgment, had all the external appearance of a place devoted to the reception of stolen goods. After remaining inside for a few minutes, he came out whistling, with his finger and thumb in his waistcoat pocket. Some men would now have arrested him on the spot. I remembered the necessity of catching the two Confederates, and the importance of not interfering with the appointment that had been made for the next morning. Such coolness as this, under trying circumstances, is rarely to be found, I should imagine, in a young beginner whose reputation as a detective policeman is still to make. From the house of suspicious appearance, Mr. J. betook himself to a cigar divan and read the magazines over a cheroot. From the divan, he strolled to the tavern and had his chops. I strolled to the tavern and had my chops. When he had done, he went back to his lodgings. When I had done, I went back to mine. He was overcome with drowsiness early in the evening and went to bed. As soon as I heard him snoring, I was overcome with drowsiness and went to bed also. Early in the morning, my two subordinates came to make their report. They had seen the man named Jack leave the woman at the gate of an apparently respectable villa residence not far from the Regent's Park. Left to himself, he took a turning to the right, which led to a sort of suburban street principally inhabited by shopkeepers. He stopped at the private door of one of the houses and let himself in with his own key, looking about him as he opened the door and staring suspiciously at my men as they lounged along the opposite side of the way. These were all the particulars which the subordinates had to communicate. I kept them in my room to attend on me, if needful, and mounted to my peephole to have a look at Mr. J. He was occupied in dressing himself, and was taking extraordinary pains to destroy all traces of the natural slovenliness of his appearance. This was precisely what I expected. A vagabond like Mr. J knows the importance of giving himself a respectable look when he is going to run the risk of changing a stolen banknote. At 5 minutes past 10 o'clock, he had given the last brush to his shabby hat and the last scouring with breadcrumb to his dirty gloves. At 10 minutes past 10, he was in the street on his way to the nearest cab stand, and I and my subordinates were close on his heels. He took a cab, and we took a cab. I had not overheard them appoint a place of meeting when following them in the park on the previous day, but I soon found that we were proceeding in the old direction of the Avenue Road gate. The cab in which Mr. J was riding turned into the park slowly. We stopped outside to avoid exciting suspicion. I got out to follow the cab on foot. Just as I did so, I saw it stop, and detected the two Confederates approaching it from among the trees. They got in, and the cab was turned about directly. I ran back to my own cab, and told the driver to let them pass him, and then to follow as before. The man obeyed my directions, but so clumsily as to excite their suspicions. We had been driving after them about 3 minutes, returning along the road by which we had advanced, when I looked out of the window to see how far they might be ahead of us. As I did this, I saw 2 hats popped out of the windows of their cab, and 2 faces looking back at me. I sank into my place in a cold sweat. The expression is coarse, but no other form of words can describe my condition at that trying moment. "We are found out," I said faintly to my 2 subordinates. They stared at me in astonishment. My feelings changed instantly from the depth of despair to the height of indignation. "It's the cabman's fault. Get out, one of you," I said with dignity. "Get out and punch his head." Instead of following my directions, I should wish this act of disobedience to be reported at headquarters. They both looked out of the window. Before I could pull them back, they both sat down again. Before I could express my just indignation, they both grinned and said, "Please to look out, sir." I did look out. Their cab had stopped. Where? At a church door. What effect this discovery might have had upon the ordinary run of men, I don't know. Being of a strong religious turn myself, it filled me with horror. I have often read of the unprincipled cunning of criminal persons, but I never before heard of 3 thieves attempting to double on their pursuers by entering a church. The sacrilegious audacity of that proceeding is, I should think, unparalleled in the annals of crime. I checked my grinning subordinates by a frown. It was easy to see what was passing in their superficial minds. If I had not been able to look below the surface, I might, on observing 2 nicely dressed men and 1 nicely dressed woman enter a church before 11 in the morning on a weekday, have come to the same hasty conclusion at which my inferiors had evidently arrived. As it was, appearances had no power to impose on me. I got out, and, followed by 1 of my men, entered the church. The other man I sent round to watch the vestry door. You may catch a weasel asleep, but not your humble servant, Matthew Sharpen. We stole up the gallery stairs, diverged to the organ loft, and peered through the curtains in front. There they were, all 3, sitting in a pew below. Yes, incredible as it may appear, sitting in a pew below. Before I could determine what to do, a clergyman made his appearance in full canonicals from the vestry door, followed by a clerk. My brain whirled, and my eyesight grew dim. Dark remembrances of robberies committed in vestries floated through my mind. I trembled for the excellent man in full canonicals. I even trembled for the clerk. The clergyman placed himself inside the altar rails. The 3 desperadoes approached him. He opened his book and began to read. What, you will ask? I answer, without the slightest hesitation, the first lines of the marriage service. My subordinate had the audacity to look at me, then to stuff his pocket handkerchief into his mouth. I scorned to pay any attention to him. After I had discovered that the man Jack was the bridegroom, and that the man J acted the part of the father and gave away the bride, I left the church, followed by my men, and joined the other subordinate outside the vestry door. Some people in my position would now have felt rather crestfallen, and would have begun to think that they had made a very foolish mistake. Not the faintest misgiving of any kind troubled me. I did not feel in the slightest degree depreciated in my own estimation. And even now, after a lapse of 3 hours, my mind remains, I am happy to say, in the same calm and hopeful condition. As soon as I and my subordinates were assembled together outside the church, I intimated my intention of still following the other cab in spite of what had occurred. My reason for deciding on this course will appear presently. The two subordinates appeared to be astonished at my resolution. One of them had the impertinence to say to me, "If you please, sir, who is it that we are after? A man who has stolen money, or a man who has stolen a wife?" The other low person encouraged him by laughing. Both have deserved an official reprimand, and both, I sincerely trust, will be sure to get it. When the marriage ceremony was over, the three got into their cab, and once more our vehicle, neatly hidden round the corner of the church so that they could not suspect it to be near them, started to follow theirs. We traced them to the terminus of the Southwestern Railway. The newly married couple took tickets for Richmond, paying their fare with a half-sovereign, and so depriving me of the pleasure of arresting them, which I should certainly have done if they had offered a banknote. They parted from Mr. J, saying, "Remember the address, 14 Babylon Terrace. You dine with us tomorrow week." Mr. J accepted the invitation and added, jocosely, that he was going home at once to get off his clean clothes and to be comfortable and dirty again for the rest of the day. I have to report that I saw him home safely, and that he is comfortable and dirty again, to use his own disgraceful language at the present moment. Here the affair rests, having by this time reached what I may call its first stage. I know very well what persons of hasty judgment will be inclined to say of my proceedings thus far. They will assert that I have been deceiving myself all through in the most absurd way. They will declare that the suspicious conversations which I have reported referred solely to the difficulties and dangers of successfully carrying out a runaway match, and they will appeal to the scene in the church as offering undeniable proof of the correctness of their assertions. So let it be. I dispute nothing up to this point, but I ask a question, out of the depths of my own sagacity as a man of the world, which the bitterest of my enemies will not, I think, find it particularly easy to answer. Granted the fact of the marriage, what proof does it afford me of the innocence of the three persons concerned in that clandestine transaction? It gives me none. On the contrary, it strengthens my suspicions against Mr. J and his confederates, because it suggests a distinct motive for their stealing the money. A gentleman who is going to spend his honeymoon at Richmond wants money, and a gentleman who is in debt to all his tradespeople wants money. Is this an unjustifiable imputation of bad motives? In the name of outraged morality, I deny it. These men have combined together and have stolen a woman. Why should they not combine together and steal a cash box? I take my stand on the logic of rigid virtue, and I defy all the sophistry of vice to move me an inch out of my position. Speaking of virtue, I may add that I have put this view of the case to Mr. and Mrs. Yatman. That accomplished and charming woman found it difficult at first to follow the close chain of my reasoning. I am free to confess that she shook her head and shed tears and joined her husband in premature lamentation over the loss of the £200. But a little careful explanation on my part, and a little attentive listening on hers, ultimately changed her opinion. She now agrees with me that there is nothing in this unexpected circumstance of the clandestine marriage which absolutely tends to divert suspicion from Mr. J, or Mr. Jack, or the runaway lady. Audacious hussy was the term my fair friend used in speaking of her, but let that pass. It is more to the purpose to record that Mrs. Yatman has not lost confidence in me, and that Mr. Yatman promises to follow her example and do his best to look hopefully for future results. I have now, in the new turn that circumstances have taken, to await advice from your office. I pause for fresh orders with all the composure of a man who has got 2 strings to his bow. When I traced the 3 Confederates from the church door to the railway terminus, I had 2 motives for doing so. First, I followed them as a matter of official business, believing them still to have been guilty of the robbery. Secondly, I followed them as a matter of private speculation, with a view of discovering the place of refuge to which the runaway couple intended to retreat, and of making my information a marketable commodity to offer the young lady's family and friends. Thus, whatever happens, I may congratulate myself beforehand on not having wasted my time. If the office approves of my conduct, I have my plan ready for farther proceedings. If the office blames me, I shall take myself off with my marketable information to the genteel villa residence in the neighborhood of the Regent's Park. Anyway, the affair puts money into my pocket and does credit to my penetration as an uncommonly sharp man. I have only one more word to add, and it is this. If any individual ventures to assert that Mr. J and his confederates are innocent of all share in the stealing of the cash box, I, in return, defy that individual, though he may even be Chief Inspector Theakstone himself, to tell me who has committed the robbery at Rutherford Street, Soho. Strong in that conviction, I have the honor to be your very obedient servant, Matthew Sharpen. From Chief Inspector Theakstone to Sergeant Bulmer. Birmingham, July 9th. Sergeant Bulmer. That empty-headed puppy, Mr. Matthew Sharpen, has made a mess of the case at Rutherford Street, exactly as I expected he would. Business keeps me in this town, so I write to you to set the matter straight. I enclose with this the pages of the feeble scribble-scrabble, which the creature Sharpen calls a report. Look them over, and when you have made your way through all the gabble, I think you will agree with me that the conceited booby has looked for the thief in every direction but the right one. You can lay your hand on the guilty person in 5 minutes now. Settle the case at once. Forward your report to me at this place, and tell Mr. Sharpen that he is suspended till farther notice. Yours, Francis Theakstone. From Sergeant Bulmer to Chief Inspector Theakstone. London, July 10th. Inspector Theakstone. Your letter and enclosure came safe to hand. Wise men, they say, may always learn something, even from a fool. By the time I had got through Mr. Sharpen's maundering report of his own folly, I saw my clear way enough to the end of the Rutherford Street case, just as you thought I should. In half an hour's time, I was at the house. The first person I saw there was Mr. Sharpen himself. "Have you come to help me?" says he. "Not exactly," says I. "I've come to tell you that you are suspended till farther notice." "Very good," says he, not taken down by so much as a single peg in his own estimation. "I thought you would be jealous of me. It's very natural, and I don't blame you. Walk in, pray, and make yourself at home. I'm off to do a little detective business on my own account in the neighborhood of the Regent's Park. Ta-ta, Sergeant. Ta-ta." With those words, he took himself out of the way, which was exactly what I wanted him to do. As soon as the maid-servant had shut the door, I told her to inform her master that I wanted to say a word to him in private. She allowed me into the parlor behind the shop, and there was Mr. Yatman, all alone, reading the newspaper. "About the matter of the robbery, sir," says I, "he cut me short, peevishly enough, being naturally a poor, weak, womanish sort of man. 'Yes, yes, I know,' says he. 'You have come to tell me that your wonderfully clever man, who has bored holes in my second-floor partition, has made a mistake, and is off the scent of the scoundrel who has stolen my money.' 'Yes, sir,' says I, 'that is one of the things I came to tell you. But I have got something else to say besides that.' 'Can you tell me who the thief is?' says he, more pettish than ever. 'Yes, sir,' says I. 'I think I can.' He put down the newspaper and began to look rather anxious and frightened. 'Not my shopman,' says he. 'I hope for the man's own sake it's not my shopman.' 'Guess again, sir,' says I. 'That idle slut, the maid?' says he. 'She is idle, sir,' says I, 'and she is also a slut. My first inquiries about her proved as much as that. But she's not the thief.' 'Then in the name of heaven, who is?' says he. 'Will you please to prepare yourself for a very disagreeable surprise, sir,' says I, 'and in case you lose your temper, you will excuse my remarking that I am the stronger man of the two, and that, if you allow yourself to lay hands on me, I may unintentionally hurt you in pure self-defense.' He turned as pale as ashes, and pushed his chair 2 or 3 feet away from me. 'You have asked me to tell you, sir, who has taken your money,' I went on. 'If you insist on my giving you an answer—' 'I do insist,' he said faintly. 'Who has taken it?' 'Your wife has taken it,' I said, very quietly, and very positively at the same time. He jumped out of the chair, as if I had put a knife into him, and struck his fist on the table so heavily that the wood cracked again. 'Steady, sir,' says I. 'Flying into a passion won't help you to the truth.' 'It's a lie,' says he, with another smack of his fist on the table. 'A base, vile, infamous lie. How dare you—' He stopped, and fell back into the chair again, looked about him in a bewildered way, and ended by bursting out crying. 'When your better sense comes back to you, sir,' says I am sure you will be gentleman enough to make an apology for the language you have just used. In the meantime, please to listen, if you can, to a word of explanation. Mr. Sharpen has sent in a report to our inspector of the most irregular and ridiculous kind, setting down not only all his own foolish doings and sayings, but the doings and sayings of Mrs. Yatman as well. In most cases, such a document would have been fit only for the waste-paper basket. But in this particular case, it so happens that Mr. Sharpen's budget of nonsense leads to a certain conclusion, which the simpleton of a writer has been quite innocent of suspecting from the beginning to the end. Of that conclusion I am so sure that I will forfeit my place if it does not turn out that Mrs. Yatman has been practicing upon the folly and conceit of this young man, and that she has tried to shield herself from discovery by purposely encouraging him to suspect the wrong persons. I tell you that confidently, and I will even go farther. I will undertake to give a decided opinion as to why Mrs. Yatman took the money, and what she has done with it, or with a part of it. Nobody can look at that lady, sir, without being struck by the great taste and beauty of her dress. As I said those last words, the poor man seemed to find his powers of speech again. He cut me short directly, as haughtily as if he had been a duke instead of a stationer. Try some other means of justifying your vile calumny against my wife, says he. Her milliner's bill for the past year is on my file of receipted accounts at this moment. Excuse me, sir, says I, but that proves nothing. Milliners, I must tell you, have a certain rascally custom which comes within the daily experience of our office. A married lady who wishes it can keep 2 accounts at her dressmaker's. One is the account which her husband sees and pays. The other is the private account, which contains all the extravagant items, and which the wife pays secretly by installments, whenever she can. According to our usual experience, these installments are mostly squeezed out of the housekeeping money. In your case, I suspect no installments have been paid. Proceedings have been threatened. Mrs. Yatman, knowing your altered circumstances, has felt herself driven into a corner, and she has paid her private account out of your cash box. I won't believe it, says he. Every word you speak is an abominable insult to me and my wife. Are you man enough, sir, says I, taking him up short, in order to save time and words, to get that receipted bill you spoke of just now off the file, and come with me at once to the milliner's shop where Mrs. Yatman deals? He turned red in the face at that, got the bill directly, and put on his hat. I took out of my pocketbook the list containing the numbers of the lost notes, and we left the house together immediately. Arrived at the milliner's, one of the expensive West End houses, as I expected, I asked for a private interview on most important business with the mistress of the concern. It was not the first time that she and I had met over the same delicate investigation. The moment she set eyes on me, she sent for her husband. I mentioned who Mr. Yatman was and what we wanted. "This is strictly private?" inquires the husband. I nodded my head. "And confidential?" says the wife. I nodded again. "Do you see any objection, dear, to obliging the sergeant with a sight of the books?" says the husband. "None in the world, love, if you approve of it," says the wife. All this while, poor Mr. Yatman sat looking the picture of astonishment and distress, quite out of place at our polite conference. The books were brought, and 1 minute's look at the pages in which Mrs. Yatman's name figured was enough, and more than enough, to prove the truth of every word that I had spoken. There, in one book, was the husband's account which Mr. Yatman had settled, and there, in the other, was the private account, crossed off also, the date of settlement being the very day after the loss of the cash box. This said private account amounted to the sum of 175 rubles, odd shillings, and it extended over a period of 3 years. Not a single installment had been paid on it. Under the last line was an entry to this effect: "Written to for the 3rd time, June 23rd. I pointed to it and asked the milliner if that meant last June. Yes, it did mean last June, and she now deeply regretted to say that it had been accompanied by a threat of legal proceedings. "I thought you gave good customers more than 3 years' credit," says I. The milliner looks at Mr. Yatman and whispers to me, "Not when a lady's husband gets into difficulties." She pointed to the account as she spoke. The entries after the time when Mr. Yatman's circumstances became involved were just as extravagant for a person in his wife's situation as the entries for the year before that period. If the lady had economized in other things, she had certainly not economized in the matter of dress. There was nothing left now but to examine the cash book, for form's sake. The money had been paid in notes, the amounts and numbers of which exactly tallied with the figures set down in my list. After that, I thought it best to get Mr. Yatman out of the house immediately. He was in such a pitiable condition that I called a cab and accompanied him home in it. At first he cried and raved like a child, but I soon quieted him, and I must add, to his credit, that he made me a most handsome apology for his language as the cab drew up at his house door. In return, I tried to give him some advice about how to set matters right for the future with his wife. He paid very little attention to me, and went upstairs, muttering to himself about a separation. Whether Mrs. Yatman will come cleverly out of the scrape or not seems doubtful. I should say myself that she would go into screeching hysterics, and so frighten the poor man into forgiving her. But this is no business of ours. So far as we are concerned, the case is now at an end, and the present report may come to a conclusion along with it. I remain, accordingly, yours to command, Thomas Bulmer. P.S. I have to add that, on leaving Rutherford Street, I met Mr. Matthew Sharpen coming back to pack up his things. "Only think," says he, rubbing his hands in great spirits, "I've been to the Gentile Villa residence, and the moment I mentioned my business, they kicked me out directly. There were 2 witnesses of the assault, and it's worth £100 to me if it's worth a farthing." "I wish you joy of your luck," says I. "Thank you," says he. "When may I pay you the same compliment on finding the thief?" "Whenever you like," says I, "for the thief is found." "Just what I expected," says he. "I've done all the work, and now you cut in and claim all the credit. Mr. J, of course." "No," says I. "Who is it then?" says he. "Ask Mrs. Yatman," says I. "She's waiting to tell you." "All right. I'd much rather hear it from that charming woman than from you," says he, and goes into the house in a mighty hurry. What do you think of that, Inspector Theakstone? Would you like to stand in Mr. Sharpen's shoes? I shouldn't, I can promise you. From Chief Inspector Theakstone to Mr. Matthew Sharpen, July 12th. Sir, Sergeant Bulmer has already told you to consider yourself suspended until farther notice. I have now authority to add that your services as a member of the detective police are positively declined. You will please to take this letter as notifying officially your dismissal from the force. I may inform you privately that your rejection is not intended to cast any reflections on your character. It merely implies that you are not quite sharp enough for our purposes. If we are to have a new recruit among us, we should infinitely prefer Mrs. Yatman. Your obedient service, Francis Theakstone. Note on the preceding correspondence, added by Mr. Theakstone. The inspector is not in a position to append any explanations of importance to the last of the letters. It has been discovered that Mr. Matthew Sharpen left the house in Rutherford Street 5 minutes after his interview outside of it with Sergeant Bulmer, his manner expressing the liveliest emotions of terror and astonishment, and his left cheek displaying a bright patch of red, which looked as if it might have been the result of what is popularly termed a smart box on the ear. He was also heard by the shopmen at Rutherford Street to use a very shocking expression in reference to Mrs. Yatman, and was seen to clench his fist vindictively as he ran round the corner of the street. Nothing more has been heard of him, and it is conjectured that he has left London with the intention of offering his valuable services to the provincial police. On the interesting domestic subject of Mr. and Mrs. Yatman, still less is known. It has, however, been positively ascertained that the medical attendant of the family was sent for in a great hurry on the day when Mr. Yatman returned from the milliner's shop. The neighboring chemist received, soon afterwards, a prescription of a soothing nature to make up for Mrs. Yatman. The day after, Mr. Yatman purchased some smelling salts at the shop and afterward appeared at the circulating library to ask for a novel descriptive of high life that would amuse an invalid lady. It has been inferred from these circumstances that he has not thought it desirable to carry out his threat of separating from his wife, at least in the present presumed condition of that lady's sensitive nervous system. A Singular Abduction by Rodrigues Ottolengui. Mr. Barnes was alone in his sanctum when an elderly gentleman of cultured manners was ushered in. The visitor sank into a seat and began his appeal at once. "Oh, Mr. Barnes," said he, "I am in great distress. I hardly dared to hope that assistance were possible until I met my friend Mr. Leroy Mitchell. You remember him?" Mr. Barnes assented with a smile. "Well," continued the old gentleman, "Mr. Mitchell said that you could surely assist me." "Certainly I will do all that is in my power," said the detective. "You are very kind. I hope you can aid me, but let me tell you the story. I am Richard Gedney, the broker. Perhaps you have heard the name?" Mr. Barnes nodded. "I thought so. Old Dick, they called me on the street, and sometimes Old Nick. But that is only their joke. I do not believe they really dislike me, though I have grown rich. I have never cheated anyone, nor wronged a friend in my life. But that is immaterial, except that it makes it hard to understand how anyone could have done me the great injury of stealing my daughter." "Stealing your daughter?" interrupted the detective. "Abduction. Abduction, I suppose, is your technical term. I call it plain stealing. To take a girl of 14 away from her father's home is stealing, plain and simple." "When did this occur?" 2 days ago. Tuesday morning we missed her, though she may have been taken in the night. She was slightly ill on Monday evening, and her maid sent for the doctor, who ordered her to be put to bed and kept there. Next morning, that is, Tuesday, he called early, as he was going out on his rounds. He was admitted by the butler and went straight up to her room. He came down a few minutes later, rang the doorbell to call a servant, and reported that the child was not in her room. He left word that she must be put back to bed and that he would return in an hour. The butler gave the message to her maid, who became alarmed, as she supposed her mistress to be in bed. A search was begun, but the child had vanished. "How is it, Mr. Gedney, that the doctor did not speak to you personally instead of to the servant?" "I cannot too much condemn myself. You see, I am an old whist player, and the temptation to play made me linger so late with some friends on Monday night that I preferred to remain in Newark, where I was, and so did not reach home until 10 o'clock Tuesday morning. By that time, the misfortune had occurred." "Have you made no discoveries as to what has become of her?" "None. We have sent to all of our friends in the vain hope that she might have risen early and gone out. But no one has seen her. She has disappeared as thoroughly as though she had been swallowed by an earthquake. Here, however, is a letter which reached me this morning. I cannot tell whether there is anything in it, or whether it is merely a cruel joke perpetrated by some crank who has heard of my loss." He handed the letter to the detective, who read as follows: "Your daughter is safe, if you are sensible. If you want her back, all you have to do is state your figures. Make them high enough, and she'll be with you. Put a personal in Herald for D.M., and I will answer." "Mr. Gedney," said Mr. Barnes, I am afraid this is a serious case. What has been done so thoroughly well accomplished that I believe we have no fool to deal with. His is a master hand. We must begin our work at once. I will take this up personally. Come, we must go out." They proceeded first to the Herald uptown office, and Mr. Barnes inserted the following advertisement. "D.M. Communicate at once, stating lowest terms. Gedney." "Now we will go to your home, Mr. Gedney," said Mr. Barnes, and thither they went. Seating himself in a comfortable leather chair in the library, Mr. Barnes asked that the butler should be called. The man entered the room, and it was apparent at once that here was a good servant of the old English type. "Moulton," began Mr. Barnes, "I am a detective. I am going to find out where your young mistress has been taken." "I hope so, sir," said the butler. "Very well," said the detective. "Now, answer a few questions explicitly, and you may give me great assistance. On Tuesday morning, you admitted the doctor. At what time was it?" "It was about 8 o'clock, sir. We had just taken our seats at breakfast in the servants' hall when the bell rang. That is how I know the hour. We are regular about meals in this house. We eat at 8 and the master at 9. "What happened when you admitted the doctor?" "He asked for Miss Nora, and I told him she was not down yet. He said he supposed he could go up, and I said I supposed so, and he went." "What did you do next?" "I went back to my breakfast." "Did you tell the maid that the doctor had called?" "Not just then, sir, for she had not come into the breakfast room." "When did you tell her?" "After I saw the doctor the second time. I heard the doorbell again, and went up when, to my surprise, there was the doctor. He said he rang because he did not know how else to call me. Then he said that Miss Nora had left her room, which was against the orders he gave the night before, and that I was to tell the maid to have her back to bed, and that he would call again. I went back to the breakfast room. This time the maid was there, and frightened she was when I gave her the message." "How long was it after you admitted the doctor the first time that you answered his second ring?" "I should think 5 minutes, sir, though it might have been 10. "And during this 5 or 10 minutes, the maid was not in the breakfast room?" "No, sir." "Send her to me." The butler left the room, and whilst waiting for the maid, Mr. Barnes addressed Mr. Gedney. "Mr. Gedney," said he, "you have not told me the name of the doctor." "His name is Donaldson. Everybody knows Dr. Donaldson." "Has he served you long?" "Ever since I came to live in this neighborhood. About 2 years, I should say. He has seemed to be very fond of Eleonora. Why, he has been here a half-dozen times asking for news of her since her disappearance. He has a curious theory, which I can hardly credit. He thinks she may have wandered off in the night asleep. But then he has not seen this letter from D.M. yet. I would like to speak to him about his somnambulistic idea. Do you think he will drop in today?" "He may be in at any moment, as he has not yet called this morning. Here is my daughter's maid." This directed the attention of Mr. Barnes to a young woman who at that moment entered. She was evidently dreadfully alarmed at being summoned to meet a detective, and her eyes showed that she had been weeping. "Come, my girl," said Mr. Barnes reassuringly. "You need not be frightened. I am not an ogre. I only wish to ask you a few questions. You are willing to help me find your mistress, are you not?" "Oh, indeed, yes, sir." "Then begin by telling me how she was on Monday night when you sent for the doctor." The girl composed herself with an effort, evidently satisfied that a detective was just like any ordinary man, and replied, Miss Nora acted rather odd all Monday and was melancholy-like. She could sit there and stare out of the window and not answer when she was spoken to. I thought perhaps something had bothered her, and so I left her alone, meaning to speak to her father at dinner time. But he sent a telegram saying he had to go out of town. So when Miss Nora wouldn't come down to dinner and wouldn't answer me, but just kept staring out of the window, I got scared a little, and I thought it best to send for Dr. Donaldson. What did he say when he came? He talked to her, but she wouldn't answer him either. He patted her on the head and said she was sulky. Then he told me perhaps she was angry because her father hadn't come home, but that she must not be allowed to brood over trifles. He said I must put her to bed, and he gave her some medicine that he said would put her to sleep. Did you have any trouble to get her to bed? No, sir, though that was strange. She just stood still and let me do everything. She did not help me or prevent me. When did you see her after that? I never saw her after that. And she began to cry softly. Come, come, don't cry. Your mistress is all right. I will bring her back. Now, tell me, why did you not see her again? Is it not your business to attend her in the morning? Yes, sir, but she only gets up about 8 o'clock, and the doctor told me he would call the first thing in the morning, and that I must not disturb her till he came. He said he wanted to wake her himself and see how she acted. You were not in the breakfast room at 8 o'clock, said the detective, watching her closely. Where were you? The girl turned crimson and stammered a few words inaudibly. Come, tell me where you were. You were somewhere, you know. Where were you? I was in the downstairs hallway, she said slowly. Doing what? I was talking to the policeman, she replied more reluctantly. Your beau? Asked Barnes significantly. No, sir. He is my husband. She tossed her head defiantly, now that her secret was divulged. Your husband, said Mr. Barnes, slightly surprised. Why, then, did you hesitate to tell me of him? Because, she stammered again, much troubled. Because maybe if I hadn't been talking to him, Miss Nora wouldn't have been carried off. He might have seen the thief. Just so, said Mr. Barnes. Well, that will do. The girl retired only too gladly. Mr. Barnes asked to be shown the room where the missing girl had slept, and made minute examinations of everything. Up in the room, a thought occurred to him, and he once more asked for the maid. Can you tell me, he asked, whether your mistress took any of her clothing with her? Well, sir, she replied, I missed the whole suit that she wore on Monday. It looks as though she must have dressed herself. Mr. Barnes made a few notes in his memorandum book, and then, with Mr. Gedney, returned to the library. Here they found Dr. Donaldson, who had arrived whilst they were upstairs. Mr. Gedney introduced the doctor, a genial, pleasant man, who shook Mr. Barnes cordially by the hand, saying, I am delighted, Mr. Barnes, that my old friend Gedney has been sensible enough to engage you to unravel this affair, rather than call in the police. The police are bunglers anyway, and only make scandal and publicity. You have looked into the matter, eh? What do you think? That is precisely the question, Doctor, which I wish to ask you. What do you think? Mr. Gedney says you suspect somnambulism. I only said it might be that. I would not like to be too positive. You know that I was called to see the dear girl Monday night. Well, I found her in a strange mood. In fact, thinking it over, I have almost convinced myself that what we took for stubbornness, sulks, I think I called it, was somnambulism. That, in fact, she was asleep when I saw her. That would account for her not replying to questions and offering no resistance when the maid removed her clothing to put her to bed. Still, it is merely a guess. It is possible that she got up in the night and wandered out of the house. I only venture it as a possibility, a chance clue for you to work on. "What do you think of this letter?" asked Mr. Barnes, handing the doctor the anonymous communication from D.M. The doctor read it over twice, and then said, "Looks more like somnambulism than ever. Don't you see? She dressed herself in the night and wandered off. Some scoundrel has found her and taken her to his home. Knowing that her father has money, he holds her for ransom." "How do you know, doctor," said Mr. Barnes quietly, "that D.M. is a he? The communication is in typewriting, so that nothing can be learned from the chirography." "Of course, I don't know it," said the doctor testily. "Still, I'll wager that no woman ever concocted this scheme." "Again, doctor, how should her abductor know that her father is rich?" "Why, I suppose her name may be on her clothing, and once he discovered her parentage, he would know that. However they found it out, it is plain that he does know. Or how could they, or he, or she, if you wish me to be so particular, have written this letter?" This was unanswerable, so Mr. Barnes remained silent. "What move will you make first?" asked the doctor. Mr. Barnes told him of the advertisement which he had inserted, and took his departure, requesting that if Mr. Gedney received any answer, he should be notified at once. About 10:30 the next morning, Mr. Gedney presented himself to the detective and handed him the following letter. "I am glad you are sensible. Saw your advertisement, and I answer at once. I want $20,000. That is my price. Now note what I have to say, and let me emphasize the fact that I mean every word. This is my first offer. Any dickering will make me increase my price, and I will never decrease it. To save time, let me tell you something else. I have no partner in this, so there is no one to squeal on me. No one on earth but myself knows where the girl is. Now, for future arrangements. You will want to communicate with me. I don't mean you to have any chance to catch me with decoy letters or anything of that sort. I know already that you have that keen devil Barnes helping you, but he'll meet his match this time. Here is my plan. You or your detective, I don't care which, must go to the public telephone station in the Hoffman House at 2 o'clock sharp. I will go to another, never mind where, and will ring you up. When you answer, I will simply say, D.M. You will recognize the signal and can do the talking. I will not answer except by letter, because I won't even run the risk of that detective's hearing my voice, and sometime in the future recognizing it. You see, I may need Barnes myself some day, and I wouldn't like to be deprived of his valuable services. I enclose a piece of the girl's cloth dress and a lock of her hair to show you that I am dealing square. D.M. "Mr. Gedney," said Mr. Barnes, "make your mind easy. Your daughter is safe, at all events. I suppose this bit of cloth and the hair satisfy you that the scoundrel really has her?" "Yes, I'm convinced of that. But how does that make the girl safe?" "The fellow wants the money. It is to his interest to be able to restore your daughter. My business shall be to get her without payment of ransom, and to catch the abductor. I'll meet you at the Hoffman house at 2 o'clock. As soon as Mr. Gedney had gone, Mr. Barnes wrote the following note. Dr. Donaldson. Dear Sir, I believe that I am on the right track, and all through the clue supplied by yourself. Please aid me a little further. I would like to know the exact size of the missing girl. As a physician, you will supply this even better than the father. Also, inform me of any mark or peculiarity by which I may recognize her, alive or dead. Please answer at once. Yours truly, J. Barnes. This he sent by a messenger, and received the following in reply. Mr. Barnes. Dear Sir, I hope you will succeed. Eleonora is small and slim, being rather undersized for her age. I should say about 4 feet 10 inches, or thereabout. I know of no distinctive mark whereby her body could be recognized, and I hope that nothing of the sort seemingly suggested may be necessary. Yours truly, Robert Donaldson, M.D. Mr. Barnes read this, and appeared more pleased than its contents seemed to authorize. At the appointed time, he went to the Hoffman house. He found Mr. Gedney impatiently walking up and down the lobby. Mr. Gedney, said he, at the beginning of this case, you offered me my own price for recovering your daughter. Now, supposing that you pay this ransom, it would appear that you would have little need of my services. If, however, I get your daughter, and save you the necessity of paying any ransom at all, I suppose you will admit that I have earned my reward? Most assuredly. After this, Mr. Gedney was rather startled when he heard what the detective said to D.M. through the telephone. They shut themselves up in the little box, and very soon received the call, and then the signal D.M. as agreed. Mr. Barnes spoke to the abductor, who presumably was listening. We agree to your terms, said he. That is, we will pay $20,000 for the return of the girl unharmed. You are so shrewd that we suppose you will invent some scheme for receiving the money which will protect you from arrest, but at the same time, we must be assured that the girl will be returned to us unharmed. In fact, she must be given to us as soon as the money is paid. Notify us immediately, as the father is in a hurry. Mr. Barnes put up the instrument and rang off. Then he turned to Mr. Gedney and said, That may surprise you, but what may astonish you more is that we must go about obtaining $20,000 in cash at once. We will need it. Ask no questions, but depend upon me, and trust me. On the next day, Mr. Gedney received the following letter. You have more sense than I gave you credit for. So has that Barnes fellow, for it was his voice I heard through the phone. You accept my terms. Very well. I'll deal square, and not raise you, though I ought to have made it $25,000 at least. Come to the phone again today, same hour, and I'll ring you up from a different station. Then you can tell me if you will be ready tonight or tomorrow night. Either will suit me. Then here is the plan. You want to be sure the girl is all right. Then better let the ambassador be your friend, Dr. Donaldson. He knows the girl, and can tell she is all right. Let him start from his house at midnight, and drive from his office up Madison Avenue rapidly till hailed by the signal D.M. He must go fast enough to prevent being followed on foot. If there is no detective with him, or following him, he will be hailed. Otherwise, he will be allowed to pass. I will be in hiding with the girl. Warn the doctor that I will be armed and will have a bead on him all the time. Any treachery will mean death. I will take the cash, give up the girl, and the transaction will be ended." When this was shown to the detective, he proposed that he and Mr. Gedney should call upon the doctor. This they did, and, after some argument, persuaded him to undertake the recovery of the girl that same night. "Mr. Gedney has decided to obtain his child at any sacrifice," said Mr. Barnes, "and this scoundrel is so shrewd that there seems to be no way to entrap him. No effort will be made to follow you, so you need have no fear of any trouble from the thief. Only be sure that you obtain the right girl. It would be just possible that a wrong one might be given to you and a new ransom demanded." "Oh, I shall know Eleonora," said the doctor. "I will do this, but I think we ought to arrest the villain, if possible." "I do not despair of doing so," said Mr. Barnes. "Get a glimpse of his face if you can, and be sure to note where you receive the girl. When we get her, she may give me a clue upon which an arrest may be made. We will wait for you at Mr. Gedney's house." After midnight that night, Mr. Gedney paced the floor anxiously, while Mr. Barnes sat at a desk looking over some memoranda. Presently, he went into the hall and had a long talk with the butler. 1 o'clock passed, and still no news. At 1:30, however, horses' hooves sounded upon the asphalt pavement, and a few minutes later the doorbell jingled. The door was quickly opened, and the doctor entered, bearing little Eleonora asleep in his arms. "My daughter!" exclaimed the excited father. "Thank God she is restored to me." "Yes," said the doctor. "Here she is, safe and sound. I think, though, that she has been drugged, for she has slept ever since I received her." "Did you have any trouble?" asked Mr. Barnes, entering at this moment. He had lingered outside in the hall long enough to exchange a word with the butler. "None," said the doctor. "At 102nd Street, I heard the signal and stopped. A man came out of the shadow of a building, looked into the carriage and said, 'All right,' and asked if I had the cash. I replied affirmatively. He went back to the sidewalk and returned with the child in his arms, but with a pistol pointed at me. Then he said, 'Pass out the money.' I did so, and he seemed satisfied, for he gave me the child, took the package, and ran off. I saw his face, but I fear my description will not avail you, for I am sure he was disguised." "Very possibly your description will be useless," said Mr. Barnes. "But I have discovered the identity of the abductor." "Impossible!" cried the doctor, amazed. "Let me prove that I am right," said Mr. Barnes. He went to the door and admitted the butler, accompanied by the policeman who had been off his beat talking with the maid. Before his companions understood what was about to happen, Mr. Barnes said, "Officer, arrest that man!" Whereupon the policeman seized the doctor and held him as though in a vice. "What does this outrage mean?" screamed the doctor, after ineffectually endeavoring to release himself. "Put on the manacles, officer," said Mr. Barnes. "Then we can talk. He is armed, and might become dangerous." With the assistance of the detective, this was accomplished, and then Mr. Barnes addressed himself to Mr. Gedney. "Mr. Gedney, I had some slight suspicion of the truth after questioning the butler and the maid, but the first clue came with the answer to the personal. You brought that to me in the morning, and I noted that it was postmarked at the main office downtown at 6 a.m. Of course, it was possible that it might have been written after the appearance of the newspaper, but if so, The thief was up very early. The doctor, however, knew of the personal on the day previous, as I told him in your presence. That letter was written in typewriting, and I observed a curious error in the spelling of 3 words. I found the words emphasize, recognize, and recognizing. In each, instead of the Z, we have a repetition of the I, that letter being doubled. I happen to know something about writing machines. I felt certain that this letter had been written upon a calligraph. In that machine, the bar which carries the letter I is next to that which carries the letter Z. It is not an uncommon thing when a typewriter is out of order for 2 bars to fail to pass one another. Thus, in writing emphasize, the rapid writer would strike the Z key before the I had fully descended. The result would be that the Z rising would strike the I bar and carry it up again, thus doubling the I, instead of writing IZ. The repetition of the mistake was evidence that it was a faulty machine. I also noticed that this anonymous letter was upon paper from which the top had been torn away. I wrote to the doctor here, asking about the size of the girl and for any marks whereby the body could be recognized. I used the words size and recognized, hoping to tempt him to use them also in reply. In his answer, I found the word recognized and also a similar word, undersized. In both, we have a repetition of the double I error. Moreover, the paper of this letter from the doctor matched that upon which the anonymous communication had been written, provided I tore off the top, which bore his letterhead. This satisfied me that the doctor was our man. When the last letter came, proposing that he should be the ambassador, the trick was doubly sure. It was ingenious, for the abductor, of course, assured himself that he was not followed and simply brought the girl home. But I set another trap. I secretly placed a cyclometer upon the doctor's carriage. He says that tonight he drove to 102nd Street and back here, a total of 10 miles. The cyclometer, which the butler obtained for me when the doctor arrived a while ago, shows that he drove less than a mile. He simply waited at his house until the proper time to come and then drove here, bringing the girl with him. The doctor remained silent, but glared venomously at the man who had outwitted him. "But how did he get Eleonora?" asked Mr. Gedney. "That queer yarn which he told us about somnambulism first suggested to me that he was possibly less ignorant than he pretended to be. I fear, Mr. Gedney, that your daughter is ill. I judge, from the description of her condition given by her maid and admitted by this man, that she was suffering from an attack of catalepsy when he was summoned. When he called the next day, finding the girl still in a trance, he quickly dressed her and took her out to his carriage. Then he coolly returned, announced that she was not in her room, and drove away with her." "It seems incredible," exclaimed Mr. Gedney. "I have known the doctor so long that it is hard to believe that he is a criminal." "Criminals," said Mr. Barnes, "are often created by opportunity. That was probably the case here. The case is most peculiar. It is a crime which none but a physician could have conceived, and that one fact makes possible what to a casual observer might seem most improbable. An abduction is rarely successful because of the difficulties which attend the crime, not the least of which are the struggles of the victim and the story which will be told after the return of the child. Here, All this was obviated. The doctor recognized catalepsy at the first visit. Perhaps during the night, the possibility of readily compelling you to pay him a large sum of money grew into a tremendous temptation. With the project half formed, he called the next morning. Circumstances favored the design. He found the girl unattended and unresistant because of her condition. He likewise knew that when he should have returned her, she would tell nothing of where she had been because of her trance. He started downstairs with her. There was no risk. If he had met anyone, any excuse for bringing her from her room would have been accepted because uttered by the family physician. He placed her in the carriage unobserved, and the most difficult part of the affair was accomplished. Many men of high degree are, at heart, rascals, but through fear, either of law or loss of position, they lead fairly virtuous lives. Temptation, accompanied by opportunity, coming to one of these, compasses his downfall, as has occurred in this instance. Criminals are recruited from all classes. The ransom money was recovered by searching the apartments of the doctor, and his guilt was thus indubitably proved. Mr. Mitchell, commenting upon the affair, simply said, "I have sent you to him, Mr. Gedney, because Mr. Barnes is above his kind. He is no ordinary detective." Audiobook. Recorded at Artist Studio 2006. Read by Adam Muskin.
The Bag of Sand by Baroness Orczy. Part 1. Of course, I knew at once by the expression on her face that morning that my dear lady had some important business on hand. She had a bundle in her arms consisting of a shabby-looking coat and skirt, and a very dowdy hat trimmed with bunches of cheap calico roses. "Put on these things at once, Mary," she said curtly, "for you are going to apply for the situation of good plain cook, so mind you look the part." "But where in the world?" I gasped in astonishment. "In the house of Mr. Nicholas Jones, in Eaton Terrace," she interrupted dryly. "The one occupied until recently by his sister, the late Mrs. Dunstan. Mrs. Jones is advertising for a cook, and you must get that place. As you know, I have carried obedience to the level of a fine art, nor was I altogether astonished that my dear lady had at least been asked to put one of her dainty fingers in that Dunstan pie, which was puzzling our fellows more completely than any other case I have ever known. I don't know if you remember the many circumstances, the various contradictions which were cropping up at every turn, and which baffled our ablest detectives at the very moment when they thought themselves most near the solution of that strange mystery. Mrs. Dunstan herself was a very uninteresting individual, self-righteous, self-conscious, and fat. A perfect type of the moneyed middle-class woman whose balance at the local bank is invariably heavier than that of her neighbors. Her niece, Violet Frostwick, lived with her, a smart, pretty girl, inordinately fond of dainty clothes and other luxuries which money can give. Being totally impecunious herself, she bore with the older woman's constantly varying caprices with almost angelic patience, a fact probably attributable to Mrs. Dunstan's testamentary intentions, which, as she often averred, were in favor of her niece. In addition to these two ladies, the household consisted of 3 servants and Miss Cruikshank. The latter was a quiet, unassuming girl who was by way of being secretary and lady help to Mrs. Dunstan, but who, in reality, was nothing but a willing drudge. Up betimes in the morning, she combined the work of a housekeeper with that of an upper servant. She interviewed the tradespeople, kept the servants in order, and ironed and smartened up Miss Violet's blouses. A Cinderella, in fact. Mrs. Dunstan kept a cook and 2 maids, all of whom had been with her for years. In addition to these, a charwoman came very early in the morning to light fires, clean boots, and do the front steps. On November 22nd, 1907, for the early history of this curious drama dates back to that year, the charwoman who had been employed at Mrs. Dunstan's house at Eaton Terrace for some considerable time sent word in the morning that in future she would be unable to come. Her husband had been obliged to move to lodgings nearer to his work, and she herself could not undertake to come the greater distance at the early hour at which Mrs. Dunstan required her. The woman had written a very nice letter explaining these facts, and sent it by hand, stating at the same time that the bearer of the note was a very respectable woman, a friend of her own, who would be very pleased to oblige Mrs. Dunstan by taking on the morning's work. I must tell you that the message and its bearer arrived at Eaton Terrace somewhere about 6 a.m., when no one was down except the Cinderella of the house, Miss Cruikshank. She saw the woman, liked her appearance, and there and then engaged her to do the work subject to Mrs. Dunstan's approval. The woman, who had given her name as Mrs. Thomas, seemed very quiet and respectable. She said that she lived close by, in St. Peter's Mews, and therefore could come as early as Mrs. Dunstan wished. In fact, from that day, she came every morning at 5:30 a.m., and by 7 o'clock had finished her work and was able to go home. If, in addition to these details, I tell you that, at the same time, pretty Miss Violet Frostwick was engaged to a young Scotsman, Mr. David Athol, of whom her aunt totally disapproved, I shall have put before you all the personages who, directly or indirectly, were connected with that drama, the final act of which has not yet been witnessed either by the police or the public. Part 2. On the following New Year's Eve, Mrs. Dunstan, as was her invariable custom on that day, went to her married brother's house to dine and see the New Year in. During her absence, the usual thing occurred at Eaton Terrace. Miss Violet Frostwick took the opportunity of inviting Mr. David Athol to spend the evening with her. Mrs. Dunstan's servants, mind you, all knew of the engagement between the young people, and, with the characteristic sentimentality of their class, connived at these secret meetings and helped to hoodwink the irascible old aunt. Mr. Athol was a good-looking young man whose chief demerit lay in his total lack of money or prospects. Also, he was by way of being an actor, another deadly sin in the eyes of the puritanically minded old lady. Already, on more than one occasion, there had been vigorous wordy warfare twixt Mr. Athol and Mrs. Dunstan, and the latter had declared that, if Violet chose to take up with this mountebank, she should never see a penny of her aunt's money now or in the future. The young man did not come very often to Eaton Terrace, but on this festive New Year's Eve, when Mrs. Dunstan was not expected to be home until long after midnight, it seemed too splendid an opportunity for an ardent lover to miss. As ill luck would have it, Mrs. Dunstan had not felt very well after her copious dinner, and her brother, Mr. Nicholas Jones, escorted her home soon after 10 o'clock. Jane, the parlour-maid, who opened the front door, was in her own graphic language. "Knocked all of a heap," When she saw her mistress, knowing full well that Mr. Athol was still in the dining room with Miss Violet, and that Miss Cruikshank was at that very moment busy getting him a whiskey and soda. Meanwhile, the coat and hat in the hall had revealed the young man's presence in the house. For a moment, Mrs. Dunstan paused, whilst Jane stood by trembling with fright. Then the old lady turned to Mr. Nicholas Jones, who was still standing on the doorstep, and said quietly, "Will you telephone over to Mr. Blenkinsop, Nick, the first thing in the morning, and tell him I'll be at his office by 10 o'clock. Mr. Blenkinsop was Mrs. Dunstan's solicitor, and as Jane explained to the cook later on, what could such an appointment mean but a determination to cut Miss Violet out of the Miss's will with the proverbial shilling? After this, Mrs. Dunstan took leave of her brother and went straight into the dining-room. According to the subsequent testimony of all three servants, the mistress went on dreadful. Words were not easily distinguishable from behind the closed door, but it seems that immediately she entered, Mrs. Dunstan's voice was raised as if in terrible anger, and a few moments later Miss Violet fled crying from the dining-room and ran quickly upstairs. Whilst the door was thus momentarily opened and shut, the voice of the old lady was heard saying in majestic wrath, "That's what you have done! Get out of this house! As for her, she'll never get a penny of my money, and she may starve for aught I care." The quarrel seemed to have continued for a short while after that, the servants being too deeply awed by those last vindictive words which they had heard to take much note of what went on subsequently. Mrs. Dunstan and Mr. Athol were closeted together for some time, but apparently the old lady's wrath did not subside, for when she marched up to bed an hour later she was heard to say, "Out of this house she shall go, and the first thing in the morning too. I'll have no goings-on with a mountebank like you." Miss Cruikshank was terribly upset. "It is a frightful blow for Miss Violet," she said to cook, "but perhaps Mrs. Dunstan will feel more forgiving in the morning. I'll take her up a glass of champagne now. She is very fond of that, and it will help her to get to sleep." Miss Cruikshank went up with the champagne and told cook to see Mr. Athol out of the house, but the young man, who seemed very anxious and agitated, would not go away immediately. He stayed in the dining-room, smoking, for a while, and when the two younger servants went up to bed, he asked cook to let him remain until he had seen Miss Violet once more, for he was sure she would come down again. He had asked Miss Cruikshank to beg of her to do so. Mrs. Kennet, the cook, was a kind-hearted old woman. She had taken the young people under her special protection, and felt very vexed that the course of true love should not be allowed to run quite smoothly. So she told Mr. Athol to make himself happy and comfortable in the dining-room, and she would sit up by the fire in the library until he was ready to go. The good soul thereupon made up the fire in the library, drew a chair in front of it, and went fast to sleep. Suddenly something awoke her. She sat up and looked around in that dazed manner peculiar to people just aroused from deep sleep. She looked at the clock. It was past 3. Surely, she thought, it must have been Mr. Athol calling to her which had caused her to wake. She went into the hall where the gas had not yet been turned off, and there she saw Miss Violet, fully dressed and wearing a hat and coat in the very act of going out the front door. In the cook's own words, before she could ask a question or even utter a sound, the young girl had opened the front door, which was still on the latch, and then banged it to again. She herself having disappeared in the darkness of the street beyond. Mrs. Kennet ran to the door and out into the street as fast as her old legs would let her. But the night was an exceptionally foggy one. Violet, no doubt, had walked rapidly away, and there came no answer to Mrs. Kennet's repeated calls. Thoroughly upset and not knowing what to do, the good woman went back into the house. Mr. Athol had evidently left, for there was no sign of him in the dining-room or elsewhere. She then went upstairs and knocked at Mrs. Dunstan's door. To her astonishment, the gas was still burning in her mistress's room, and she could see a thin ray of light filtering through the keyhole. At her first knock, there came a quick, impatient answer. "What is it?" "Miss Violet, ma'am," said the cook, who was too agitated to speak very coherently. "She is gone." "The best thing she could do," came promptly from the other side of the door. "You go to bed, Mrs. Kennet, and don't worry." Whereupon the gas was suddenly turned off inside the room, and, in spite of Mrs. Kennet's further feeble protests, no other word issued from the room save another impatient, "Go to bed." The cook then did as she was bid, but before going to bed she made the round of the house, turned off all the gas, and finally bolted the front door. Part 3. Some 3 hours later, the servants were called, as usual, by Miss Cruikshank, who then went down to open the area door to Mrs. Thomas the charwoman. At 6:30, when Mary the housemaid came down, candle in hand, she saw the charwoman a flight or two lower down, also apparently in the act of going downstairs. This astonished Mary not a little, as the woman's work lay entirely in the basement, and she was supposed never to come to the upper floors. The woman, though walking rapidly down the stairs, seemed, moreover, to be carrying something heavy. "Anything wrong, Mrs. Thomas?" asked Mary in a whisper. The woman looked up, pausing a moment immediately under the gas bracket, the bypass of which shed a feeble light upon her and upon her burden. The latter Mary recognized as the bag containing the sand which, on frosty mornings, had to be strewn on the front steps of the house. On the whole, though she certainly was puzzled, Mary did not think very much about the incident then. As was her custom, she went into the housemaid's closet, got the hot water from Miss Cruikshank's bath, and carried it to the latter's room, where she also put up the blinds and got things ready generally. For Miss Cruikshank usually ran down in her dressing-gown and came up to tidy herself later on. As a rule, by the time the 3 servants got downstairs, it was nearly 7, and Mrs. Thomas had generally gone by that time. But, on this occasion, Mary was earlier. Miss Cruikshank was busy in the kitchen getting Mrs. Dunstan's tea ready. Mary spoke about seeing Mrs. Thomas on the stairs with the bag of sand, and Miss Cruikshank, too, was very astonished at the occurrence. Mrs. Kennet was not yet down, and the charwoman apparently had gone. Her work had been done as usual, and the sand was strewn over the stone steps in front, as the frosty fog had rendered them very slippery. At 7:15, Miss Cruikshank went up with Mrs. Dunstan's tea, and less than 2 minutes later a fearful scream rang through the entire house, followed by the noise of breaking crockery. In an instant, the 2 maids ran upstairs straight to Mrs. Dunstan's room, the door of which stood wide open. The first thing Mary and Jane were conscious of was a terrific smell of gas, then of Miss Cruikshank, with eyes dilated with horror, staring at the bed in front of her, whereon lay Mrs. Dunstan, with one end of a piece of india-rubber piping still resting in her mouth, her jaw having dropped in death. The other end of that piece of piping was attached to the burner of a gas bracket on the wall close by. Every window in the room was fastened and the curtains drawn. The whole room reeked of gas. Mrs. Dunstan had been asphyxiated by its fumes. Part 4. A year went by after the discovery of the mysterious tragedy, and I can assure you that our fellows at the yard had one of the toughest jobs in connection with the case that ever fell to their lot. Just think of all the contradictions which met them at every turn. Firstly, the disappearance of Miss Violet. No sooner had the women in the Dunstan household roused themselves sufficiently from their horror at the terrible discovery which they had just made, than they were confronted with another almost equally awful fact. Awful, of course, because of its connection with the primary tragedy. Miss Violet Frostwick had gone. Her room was empty, her bed had not been slept in. She, herself, had been seen by the cook, Mrs. Kennet, stealing out of the house at dead of night. To connect the pretty, dainty, young girl even remotely with a crime so hideous, so callous as the deliberate murder of an old woman who had been as a mother to her seemed absolutely out of the question, and, by tacit consent, the 4 women who now remained in the desolate and gloom-laden house of Eaton Terrace forbore to mention Miss Violet Frostwick's name either to police or doctor. Both these, of course, had been summoned immediately, Miss Cruikshank sending Mary to the police station and then to Dr. Falwell in Eaton Square, whilst Jane went off in a cab to fetch Mr. Nicholas Jones, who, fortunately, had not yet left for his place of business. The doctor's and the police inspector's first thought, on examining the mise-en-scène of the terrible tragedy, was that Mrs. Dunstan had committed suicide. It was practically impossible to imagine that a woman in full possession of health and strength would allow a piece of india-rubber piping to be fixed between her teeth and would, without a struggle, continue to inhale the poisonous fumes which would mean certain death. Yet there were no marks of injury upon the body, nothing to show how sufficient unconsciousness had been produced in the victim to permit of the miscreant completing his awesome deed. But the theory of suicide set up by Dr. Falwell was promptly refuted by the most cursory examination of the room. Though the drawers were found closed, they had obviously been turned over, as if the murderer had been in search of money, or papers, or the key of the safe. The latter, on investigation, was found to be open, whilst the key lay on the floor close by. A brief examination of the safe revealed the fact that the tin boxes must have been ransacked, for they contained neither money nor important papers now, whilst the gold and platinum settings of necklaces, bracelets, and a tiara showed that the stones, which, as Mr. Nicholas Jones subsequently averred, were of considerable value, had been carefully, if somewhat clumsily, taken out by obviously inexperienced hands. On the whole, therefore, appearances suggested deliberate, systematic, and very leisurely robbery, which wholly contradicted the theory of suicide. Then, suddenly the name of Miss Frostwick was mentioned. Who first brought it on the tapis, no one subsequently could say. But, in a moment, the whole story of the young girl's engagement to Mr. Athol, in defiance of her aunt's wishes, the quarrel of the night before, and the final disappearance of both young people, from the house during the small hours of the morning was dragged from the 4 unwilling witnesses by the able police inspector. Nay, more. One very little unpleasant circumstance was detailed by one of the maids and corroborated by Miss Cruikshank. It seems that when the latter took up the champagne to Mrs. Dunstan, the old lady desired Miss Violet to come to her room. Mary, the housemaid, was on the stairs when she saw the young girl, still dressed in her evening gown of white chiffon, her eyes still swollen with tears, knocking at her aunt's door. The police inspector was busy taking notes, already building up in his mind a simple, if very sensational, case against Violet Frostwick, when Mrs. Kennet promptly upset all his calculations. Miss Violet could have had nothing to do with the murder of her aunt, seeing that Mrs. Dunstan was alive and actually spoke to the cook when the latter knocked at her bedroom door, after she had seen the young girl walk out of the house. Then came the question of Mr. Athol, but, if you remember, it was quite impossible even to begin to build a case against the young man. His own statement that he left the house at about midnight, having totally forgotten to rouse the cook when he did so, was amply corroborated from every side. The cabman who took him up to the corner of Eaton Terrace at 11:50 p.m. was one witness in his favour. His landlady, at the rooms in Jermyn Street, who let him in, since he had mislaid the latchkey, and who took him up some tea at 7 o'clock the next morning, was another, whilst, when Mary saw Miss Violet going into her aunt's room, the clock at St. Peter's, Eaton Square, was just striking 12. I dare say you think I ought by now to have mentioned the charwoman, Mrs. Thomas, who represented the final, most complete, most hopeless contradiction in this remarkable case. Mrs. Thomas was seen by Mary, the housemaid, at 6:30 o'clock in the morning, coming down from the upper floor, where she had no business to be, and carrying the bag of sand used for strewing over the slippery front door steps. The bag of sand, of course, was always kept in that area. The moment that bag of sand was mentioned, Dr. Falwell gave a curious gasp. Here, at least, was the solution to one mystery. The victim had been stunned while still in bed by a blow on the head dealt with that bag of sand, and whilst she was unconscious, the callous miscreant had robbed her and finally asphyxiated her with the gas fumes. Where was the woman who, at 6:30 in the morning, was seen in possession of the silent instrument of death? Mrs. Thomas had disappeared. The last that was then, or ever has been seen of her, was when she passed underneath the dim light of a bypass on the landing, as if tired out with the weight which she was carrying. Since then, as you know, the police have been unswerving in their efforts to find Mrs. Thomas. The address which she had given in St. Peter's Mews was found to be false. No one of that name or appearance had ever been seen there. The woman who was supposed to have sent her with a letter of recommendation to Mrs. Dunstan knew nothing of her. She swore she had never sent anyone with a letter to Mrs. Dunstan. She gave up her work there one day because she found it too hard at such an early hour in the morning, but she never heard anything more from her late employer after that. Strange, wasn't it, that 2 people should have disappeared out of that house on that same memorable night? Of course, you will remember the tremendous sensation that was caused some 24 hours later when it transpired that the young person who had thrown herself into the river from Waterloo Bridge on that same eventful morning, and whose body was subsequently recovered and conveyed to the Thames police station, was identified as Miss Violet Frostwick, the niece of the lady who had been murdered in her own house in Eaton Terrace. Neither money nor diamonds were found on poor Miss Violet. She had herself given the most complete proof that she, at least, had no hand in robbing or killing Mrs. Dunstan. The public wondered why she took her aunt's wrath and her probable disinheritance so fearfully to heart, and sympathized with Mr. David Athol for the terribly sad loss which he had sustained. But Mrs. Thomas, the charwoman, had not yet been found. Part 5. I think I looked an extremely respectable, good plain cook when I presented myself at the house in Eaton Terrace in response to the advertisement in the Daily Telegraph. As, in addition to my prepossessing appearance, I also asked very low wages and declared myself ready to do anything except score the front steps and the stone area, I was immediately engaged by Mrs. Jones, and was duly installed in the house, the following day under the name of Mrs. Curwen. But few events had occurred here since the discovery of the dual tragedy, now more than a year ago, and none that had thrown any light upon the mystery which surrounded it. The verdict at the inquest had been one of wilful murder against a person known as Mrs. Thomas, the weight of evidence, coupled with her disappearance, having been very heavy against her, and there was a warrant out for her arrest. Mrs. Dunstan had died intestate. To the astonishment of all those in the know, she had never signed the will which Messieurs Blenkinsop and Blenkinsop had drafted for her, and wherein she bequeathed £20,000 and the lease of her house in Eaton Terrace to her beloved niece Violet Frostwick, £1,000 to Miss Cruikshank, and other smaller legacies to friends or servants. In default of a will, Mr. Nicholas Jones, only brother of the deceased, became possessed of all her wealth. He was a very rich man himself, and many people thought that he ought to give Miss Cruikshank the £1,000, which the poor girl had thus lost through no fault of her own. What his ultimate intentions were with regard to this no one could know. For the present, he contented himself with moving to Eaton Terrace with his family, and, as his wife was a great invalid, he asked Miss Cruikshank to continue to make her home in the house, and to help in its management. Neither the diamonds nor the money stolen from Mrs. Dunstan's safe were ever traced. It seems that Mrs. Dunstan, a day or two before her death, had sold a freehold cottage, which she owned near Teddington. The money, as is customary, had been handed over to her in gold in Mr. Blenkinsop's office, and she had been foolish enough not to bank it immediately. This money and the diamonds had been the chief spoils of her assailant, and all the while no trace of Mrs. Thomas, in spite of the most strenuous effort on the part of the police to find her. Strangely enough, when I had been in Eaton Terrace about 3 days, and was already getting very tired of early rising and hard work, the charwoman there fell ill one day and did not come to her work as usual. I, of course, grumbled like 6, for I had to be on my hands and knees the next morning scrubbing stone steps, and my thoughts of Lady Molly, for the moment, were not quite as loyal as they usually were. Suddenly, I heard a shuffling footstep close behind me. I turned and saw a rough-looking, ill-dressed woman standing at the bottom of the steps. "What do you want?" I asked sourly, for I was in a very bad humor. "I saw you scrubbing them steps, miss," she replied in a raucous voice. My husband is out of work, and the children hain't had no breakfast this morning. I'd do them steps, miss, if you'd give me a trifle." The woman certainly did not look very prepossessing with her shabby, broad-brimmed hat hiding the upper part of her face, and her skirt, torn and muddy, pinned up untidily round her stooping figure. However, I did not think that I could be doing anything very wrong by letting her do this one bit of rough work which I hated. So I agreed to give her 6 pence and left her there with kneeling mat and scrubbing brush, and went in, leaving, however, the front door open. In the hall, I met Miss Cruikshank, who, as usual, was down before everybody else. "What is it, Miss Kerwin?" she asked, for through the open door she had caught sight of the woman kneeling on the step. "A woman, miss," I replied somewhat curtly. "She offered to do the steps. I thought Mrs. Jones wouldn't mind, as Mrs. Callahan hasn't turned up." Miss Cruikshank hesitated an instant and then walked up to the front door. At the same moment the woman looked up, rose from her knees, and boldly went up to accost Miss Cruikshank. "You'll remember me, miss," she said in her raucous voice. "I used to work for Miss Dunstan once. My name is Mrs. Thomas." No wonder Miss Cruikshank uttered a quickly smothered cry of horror. Thinking that she would faint, I ran to her assistance, but she waved me aside and then said quite quietly, "This poor woman's mind is deranged. She is no more Mrs. Thomas than I am. Perhaps we had better send for the police." "Yes, miss, perhaps you'd better," said the woman with a sigh. "My secret has been weighing heavy on me of late." "But, my good woman," said Miss Cruikshank very kindly, for I suppose she thought, as did I, that this was one of those singular cases of madness which sometimes cause innocent people to accuse themselves of undiscovered crimes. "You are not Mrs. Thomas at all. I know Mrs. Thomas well, and—" "Of course you know me, miss," replied the woman. "The last conversation you and I had together was in the kitchen that morning when Mrs. Dunstan was killed. I remember you saying to me, 'Fetch the police, Kerwin,'" said Miss Cruikshank peremptorily. Whereupon the woman broke into a harsh and loud laugh of defiance. To tell you the truth, I was not a little puzzled. That this scene had been foreseen by my dear lady, and that she had sent me to this house on purpose that I should witness it, I was absolutely convinced. But here was my dilemma. Ought I to warn the police at once or not? On the whole, I decided that my best plan would undoubtedly be to communicate with Lady Molly first of all, and to await her instructions. So I ran upstairs, scribbled a hasty note to my dear lady, and, in response to Miss Cruikshank's orders, flew out of the house through the area gate, noticing as I did so that Miss Cruikshank was still parleying with the woman on the doorstep. I sent the note off to Maid Vale by taxicab. Then I went back to Eaton Terrace. Miss Cruikshank met me at the front door and told me that she had tried to detain the woman pending my return, but that she felt very sorry for the unfortunate creature who obviously was laboring under a delusion, and she had allowed her to go away. About an hour later, I received a curt note from Lady Molly, ordering me to do nothing whatever without her special authorization. In the course of the day, Miss Cruikshank told me that she had been to the police station and had consulted with the inspector, who said there would be no harm in engaging the pseudo Mrs. Thomas to work at Eaton Terrace, especially as thus she would remain under observation. Then, following a curious era in Mr. Nicholas Jones' otherwise well-ordered household, we 3 servants, instead of being called at 6 as heretofore, were allowed to sleep on until 7. When we came down, we were not scolded. On the contrary, we found our work already done. The charwoman, whoever she was, must have been a very hard-working woman. It was marvelous what she accomplished single-handed before 7 a.m., by which time she had invariably gone. The two maids, of course, were content to let this pleasant state of things go on, but I was devoured with curiosity. One morning I crept quietly downstairs and went into the kitchen soon after 6. I found the pseudo-Mrs. Thomas sitting at a very copious breakfast. I noticed that she had on altogether different, though equally shabby and dirty, clothes from those she had worn when she first appeared on the doorstep of 180 Eaton Terrace. Near her plate were 3 or 4 golden sovereigns over which she had thrown her grimy hands. Miss Cruikshank, the while, was on her hands and knees scrubbing the floor. At sight of me she jumped up, and with obvious confusion muttered something about hating to be idle, etc. That day Miss Cruikshank told me that I did not suit Mrs. Jones, who wished me to leave at the end of my month. In the afternoon I received a little note from my dear lady, telling me to be downstairs by 6 o'clock the following morning. I did as I was ordered, of course, and when I came into the kitchen punctually at 6 a.m., I found the charwoman sitting at the table with a pile of gold in front of her, which she was counting over with a very grubby finger. She had her back to me, and was saying as I entered, "I think if you was to give me another 50 quid, I'd leave you the rest now. You'd still have the diamonds and the rest of the money." She spoke to Miss Cruikshank, who was facing me, and who, on seeing me appear, turned as white as a ghost. But she quickly recovered herself, and, standing between me and the woman, said vehemently, "What do you mean by prying on me like this? Go, and pack your boxes, and leave the house this instant." But before I could reply, the woman had interposed. "Don't you fret yourself, miss," she said, placing her grimy hand on Miss Cruikshank's shoulder. "There's a bag of sand in that there corner. We'll knock her down as we did Mrs. Dunstan, eh?" "Hold your tongue, you lying fool," said the girl, who now looked like a maddened fury. "Give me that other 50 quid and I'll hold me tongue," retorted the woman boldly. "This creature is mad," said Miss Cruikshank, who had made a vigorous and successful effort to recover herself. "She is under the delusion that not only is she Mrs. Thomas, but that she murdered Mrs. Dunstan." "No, no," interrupted the woman. "I only came back this morning because I recollected that you had left the bag of sand upstairs, after you so cleverly did away with Mrs. Dunstan, robbed her of all her money and jewels, and even were sharp enough to imitate her voice when Mrs. Kennet terrified you by speaking to Mrs. Dunstan through the door." "It is false. You are not Mrs. Thomas. The 2 maids who are here now, and who were in this house at the time, can swear that you are a liar." "Let us change clothes now, Miss Cruikshank," said a voice which sounded almost weirdly in my ear in spite of its familiarity, for I could not locate whence it came. "And see if in a charwoman's dress those 2 maids would not recognize you." "Mary," continued the same familiar voice, "help me out of these filthy clothes. Perhaps Miss Cruikshank would like to resume her own part of Mrs. Thomas, the charwoman." "Liars and impostors both!" shouted the girl, who was rapidly losing all presence of mind. "I'll send for the police." "Quite unnecessary," rejoined Lady Molly coolly. "Detective Inspector Danvers is outside the door." The girl made a dash for the other door, but I was too quick for her and held her back, even whilst Lady Molly gave a short, sharp call which brought Danvers on the scene. I must say that Miss Cruikshank made a bold fight, but Danvers had 2 of our fellows with him, and arrested her on the warrant for the apprehension of the person known as Mrs. Thomas. The clothes of the charwoman who had so mysteriously disappeared had been found by Lady Molly at the back of the coal cellar, and she was still dressed in them at the present moment. No wonder I had not recognized my own dainty lady in the grimy woman who had so successfully played the part of a blackmailer on the murderess of Mrs. Dunstan. She explained to me subsequently that the first inkling that she had had of the horrible truth, namely, that it was Miss Cruikshank who had deliberately planned to murder Mrs. Dunstan by impersonating a charwoman for a while, and thus throwing dust in the eyes of the police, was when she heard of the callous words which the old lady was supposed to have uttered when she was told of Miss Violet's flight from the house in the middle of the night. "She may have been very angry at the girl's escapade," exclaimed Lady Molly to me, "but she would not have allowed her to starve. Such cruelty was out of all proportion to the offence." Then I looked about me for a stronger motive for the old lady's wrath, and, remembering what she said on New Year's Eve when Violet fled crying from the room, I came to the conclusion that her anger was not directed against her niece, but against the other girl, and against the man who had transferred his affections from Violet Frostwick to Miss Cruikshank, and had not only irritated Mrs. Dunstan by this clandestine, double-faced love-making, but had broken the heart of his trusting fiancée. No doubt Miss Cruikshank did not know that the will, whereby she was to inherit £1,000, was not signed, and no doubt she and young Athol planned out that cruel murder between them. The charwoman was also a bag of sand which was literally thrown in the eyes of the police. "But," I objected, "I can't understand how a cold-blooded creature like that Miss Cruikshank could have allowed herself to be terrorized and blackmailed. She knew that you could not be Mrs. Thomas, since Mrs. Thomas never existed." "Yes, but one must reckon a little sometimes with that negligible quantity known as conscience. My appearance as Mrs. Thomas vaguely frightened Miss Cruikshank. She wondered who I was and what I knew. When 3 days later I found the shabby clothes in the coal cellar and appeared dressed in them, she lost her head. She gave me money. From that moment she was done for. Confession was only a matter of time." And Miss Cruikshank did make full confession. She was recommended to mercy on account of her sex, but she was plucky enough not to implicate David Athol in the recital of her crime. He has since emigrated to Western Canada. This recording was brought to you by Artist Studio in the year 2006, read by Brent Bradley.